Hey everyone, I'm Michael with Hamilton Education, and today, with Reptar's help, I'm going to get you through the reading section of test number 005. Hi, I'm Michael with Hamilton Education, and today, with Reptar's help, we're going to be getting through Hamilton Test 005's reading section. Before we get to passage 1, the literature passage on this test, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the best way to approach literature. But the only way I can do that, I think, is I want to talk about how students generally perceive literature in their English classrooms and school. And through analyzing the way students understand literature in a classroom, I want to be able to demonstrate how that can kind of be counterintuitive when it comes to tackling an SAT passage. So on the page here, we can see how precisely a student is taught to interpret literature in a classroom. You're taught something that looks kind of like this, if I'm correct. There's this exposition, and then that leads to the rising action, and then that'll lead you to the climax. And then all of a sudden, the most intense part of the story, once that ends, you have the falling action, and then the resolution. And all of this, right, all of this story is centered around this conflict. Right, so the entire Lion King, for example, is centered around who's going to become the king after Mufasa dies. And the climax, obviously, coming when there's this huge fight between Simba and Scar for who's going to be king of Pride Rock. And as soon as that conflict ends, the movie's over. Now, they made a bunch of cheap sequels just as money grabs, but the main story ends when the conflict ends. And students are generally taught in their classrooms to focus on the key plot details, to understand the series of events that make up a story. And that's all well and good in a classroom setting. But the SAT doesn't structure their literature passages this way. They structure it entirely differently. They structure their SAT passages in a very character-driven way, right? The characters become the centerpiece. And now some students will ask themselves, well, why is that? And the answer is very simple. There's not enough space on an SAT literature portion for the test maker to be able to construct an intensely difficult passage full of plot twists. The only way a test maker can make a piece of literature difficult is if they cram it with character details, character traits, character development, and they throw in a couple monkey wrenches for how the characters change over the course of a passage. And so the best way we're going to be able to get through a literature passage is by paying close attention to the characters, what they're doing, what they're thinking, and what they're saying. But I want to be clear. I'm not saying to disregard plot points or to disregard key events that happen over the course of a story. That would be destructive on its own. I'm saying that we need to keep both things in our head simultaneously. That's the whole point of what we at Hamilton call active reading, the ability to hold a bunch of information in your head simultaneously and then actively engage with the ideas as they play themselves out. So a key thing to remember, not just for this test, but for any time that you turn a page in an SAT reading section and see a literature passage, you need to engage critically with the characters as they arrive and as the author describes them. And if you can do that and you can keep your eye on the structural development of how those characters operate, then the whole test and the whole passage becomes much easier. But I just want us to be perfectly clear about that before we begin. So let's work together. Let's take this passage one paragraph at a time and see what the author reveals to us about characters in the broader structure of the story. So the first thing we want to notice is you always want to take advantage of whatever information the author is going to volunteer for you, right? That's what the blurbs are for. And in the blurb, we get what doesn't seem like critical information, but what is actually very critical as it plays out over the course of the passage. So we have this younger woman named Catherine, And she's going to be introduced into more polite society by her chaperone, Mrs. Allen, right? And so the introduction into polite society is generally like a polite euphemism for she's meeting rich people, right? So she's somebody that's maybe not in that station, maybe she's in a lower class, but she's being introduced to a bunch of really rich people, and Miss Allen is the one who's going to chaperone her at whatever event she's going to meet these rich people. So let's take stock of who we get introduced to. We see three characters here, and so I'll start with the one that leads us off. Mrs. Allen in the first line. Let's turn my annotation features on. Mrs. Allen is pretty much introduced to us for the better half of the first paragraph. So around lines 1 all the way down to 14, right? This is where Miss Allen is introduced. And well, what do we know about her? Well, we don't want to infer anything about her that the author doesn't tell us. The author is going to tell us enough to go on. And one of the key mistakes we do not want to make when interpreting literature is to start letting our minds run with unqualified assumptions and start to stretch our reading of the text. We want to stay as conventional and as close to the actual words of the text as we can. We can deduce inferences, right? You can get inferences from the text, but we always want to make sure that whatever we are inferring or assuming about this text is closely related and safe to this text. So let's look at lines 1 through 14. How is Miss Allen described? Well, it's suggested, it seems, that she's not really remarkable, right? She doesn't really have the charismatic nature that would normally incline men to marry them, right? That's what lines 1 through 4 seem to suggest. She doesn't really have the charisma, right? And then that bleeds over into line 5, where it says, hey, you know, she's not beautiful, and yeah, she's not a genius, and she doesn't really have that many accomplishments, and yeah, her manner maybe isn't the type that would attract a wealthy, successful man. And so the first 5 lines are really just the author letting you know that she's just unremarkable as a woman, this Mrs. Allen. Nothing special about her. And then lines 6 through 9, this portion here, we tend to get a little bit more, I don't want to say positive attributes, but the attributes that would make Mrs. Allen desirable to male suitors, right? Like Mr. Allen, her husband. And so what are those? Well, we don't really need to speculate. It tells us 6 through 9, she has this air of a gentlewoman. She's this dainty figure. She has a great deal of quiet and active good temper. She's a very passive woman, it seems, right? She's got this quiet demeanor. She is not really active or up and around like some people are. And she has this trifling turn of mind, which is just a way of describing her general passivity. And all of these are the characteristics that will attract Mr. Allen to her. Now, Mr. Allen really isn't described that much in this first paragraph, but I think lines 8 through 9 is where we want to focus for him. 8 through 9, where he's this sensible, intelligent man. And he is taken with the demeanor or the passive demeanor of Mrs. Allen. Now we think about Catherine, lines 14 on. What do we know, right? Well, Catherine's this younger girl. She's making some purchases because, again, Miss Allen loves fashion, right? She's this woman that's all about pretenses and appearances. It even says on lines, where am I? Lines 12 and 13, where sometimes she even takes 3 or 4 days studying what the latest trends are before she'll even leave her house, right? And so she's out shopping with Catherine, and Catherine's making some purchases, and they're starting to get ready for this ball. They're getting their hair done, or they're getting their clothes hemmed by the best hand, handled with care, right? Catherine's mental state is kind of elaborated upon in lines 20 through the end of the first paragraph, where the author says, Catherine hoped at least to pass uncensored through the crowd. As for admiration, it was always very welcome when it came, but she did not depend on it. Catherine's keeping her expectations low, right? She definitely welcome attention if she wanted it, but she's not expecting it. She's not trying to cause a rouse in the crowd by her appearance. She hopes to at least pass uncensored through, which is to not make a scene out of anything. And again, I don't need to infer outside the text for this. I don't need to jump to different conclusions. I don't need to introduce my own baggage into the interpretation of the text. All I'm doing in the first 24 lines, 23 lines, is just taking what the author gives me and creating a picture of where these characters are so far. And so what I like to do annotatively is after I get through each paragraph, I like to just encapsulate it in a few words that will help me remember. And so in this little space at the end of the first paragraph, I'm just going to write Miss Allen and Catherine intro. The reason I don't include Mr. Allen's intro is he doesn't really get his own description. He gets a couple words in passing as a part of a broader description of Mrs. Allen. And so this is where we're off and running. We have our characters, the scene has been set, and we know where the thing is going from here. Okay, paragraph 2, lines about 24 down to 47. Again, they go to the ball, right? The first part we have to find, 24 through 25, Miss Allen actually makes them late. And again, we see this character trait come up, right? The being in love with fashion, the being so obsessed with a certain appearance or to be kept fine or to look fine. Mrs. Allen drags everybody down, makes Catherine late for the ball, and that's the first sort of plot point we get. But the plot point is derivative of Mrs. Allen's character trait. She really obsesses over looking good. That obsession gets carried too far, and she ends up being late. Now, what else do we know? 27 through 30, the fashion stuff, it just keeps going. You'll tend to see, as soon as character traits are developed, authors hammer them over the course of a passage. And so here, Miss Allen cares more about her gown than Catherine. She's so obsessed with her appearance, how she appears to other people in the bar, that she's not in the ball, that she's not even considering how Catherine is dealing with the social aspect of the event. Right? There's this crowd, lines, I believe, 30 down through 36. Catherine finally starts to develop this feeling that she's at a ball. She gets to look out and she sees all of the people having a party, but she's having a really hard time making connections or meeting acquaintances with people, right? Getting acquainted with anybody, right? Particularly just friends of polite society that she's trying to meet. And Mrs. Allen gives her kind of these passive, kind of inauthentic, disingenuous, I can't believe you can't find anybody. I'm so sorry you can't find anybody, my dear. Right? She says on lines 42 through 43, I wish you could dance, my dear. I wish you could get a partner. And here's where we see a shift in Catherine. And you should always pay attention to these shifts in personality between characters. And the active reader, the successful active reader in this context is saying to themselves, okay, I'm noticing a shift in how these characters are interacting. I bet you the test maker is going to ask a question about that, right? We talk a lot at Hamilton Education about trying to put ourselves in the position of a test maker, someone who's trying to design questions to baffle even the best and brightest students. This is how you combat it. You stay at one step ahead. You do what I call playing with a lead, right? Like one of the greatest moments of my life, I got to play chess against the grandmaster in New York. And we sat down, and 4 moves in, the guy whispers to his translator, and the translator says to me, well, sir, he wants to tell you he's going to win in 5 turns. And he just wants to know if you want to play further. And the competitive person in me is like, absolutely, I want to finish the game. 5 turns later, he wins. And I asked him in that moment through his translator, how is it that you could understand that you were going to win at that precise moment? And he just, without even talking, he just set the board up the way it was when he told me. And he went through all of these scenarios as if to say, well, if you went here, I would have done this to trigger this chain of events that I would have won in this many turns, or this many turns in this direction, that many turns in this direction. But notice why he was able to do it. He was actively engaging in the game. He wasn't a passive player. He was perceiving where the game could go, right? Great readers, great athletes, great businessmen, they perceive what's coming next almost as much as the average person can perceive what's happening now. And that's a skill we're going to try to really cultivate over the rest of this program. It's being able to see ahead and see down the road and predict. I see this shift in character attitude towards each other. And all of a sudden, the bells start going off. And then I'm prepared to answer the question if it gets asked of me. And that just makes your job as a student and a test taker so much easier. It's way easier to expend the intellectual energy to answer 9 questions as opposed to 10. And notice again what anticipation does. If I can understand that this is a critical moment that the test maker might ask, I can start to think about how they'll ask me. And if I can start to think about how they'll ask me, I can then start to think, well, what would the correct answer sound like to that question? And so I say to myself at the end of paragraph 2, I look at it and I go, well, it says for a time her young friend felt obliged to her for these wishes, but they were repeated so often and proved so totally ineffectual that Catherine grew tired at last and would thank her no more. I know that sounds like Catherine's getting annoyed or frustrated, right? At first, she's very grateful to Mrs. Allen, and we can see why, right? She's making sure she looks beautiful. She had the best hands helping her get ready. She's ostensibly going to introduce her to all of these high society types at this ball, and she's very grateful for that. And then over time in this ball, when she's not meeting anybody, she's not getting to dance with anybody, now you can see it's starting to get annoying, right? It's kind of like that friend who consistently lets you down but continues to say sorry. After a while, there's diminishing returns, right? So again, before we move to paragraph 3, let's take stock of what we have here, right? First paragraph, we had introductions to characters. Now we have Catherine getting annoyed, or Catherine growing frustrated. And some students at this point will say, well, Michael, you're not really capturing that much information. And what I would say to you is you need to fight that assumption that students have, that you need to memorize every specific detail of a passage or every line in a passage. It's next to impossible to do that. What you need to understand is you need to take the big picture read, the big picture impression, and you need to craft a roadmap for future reference. You're not going to be able to hold all the information in your head. That's just inconceivable. Geniuses have a hard time doing that, and geniuses are few and far between, right? Kids that get perfect scores in the reading section don't do that. What you need to be able to do is create a roadmap so that when you get asked particular questions, you know where to go. And then you can trust yourself that you're a smart kid and that you'll be able to interpret it correctly when you get to the right place. So yeah, I'm not really putting down super detailed descriptions of what's going on, but I'm guiding my eyes for when I have to look back, right? Catherine's growing annoyed. And so that triggers a whole bunch of information that I can then draw on. Why is she frustrated? Well, okay, I go back to that point. She's frustrated because she's not meeting anybody. She might not be meeting anybody because Mrs. Allen made them late, so on and so forth. But so what we're taking away from the first 2 paragraphs is we're reading for the character development. I have my characters. I have how their relationships are starting to change. And I understand the plot details for why it's changing. And when it comes to my annotative method, I'm not getting bogged down with super detailed note taking, underlining everything, circling everything, making detailed notes in every line or every couple lines. It's unnecessary. You need to train yourself to look at the big picture of what's going on, the broad pattern and structure. It's like my mother would always tell me, this old, small Italian woman, maybe I hope she hasn't ever watched this, I call her old. She would always tell me to not miss the forest for the trees. And that's what you need to do on this test. Don't miss the big picture because you're caught up in what the word protege might mean, right? Or you're caught up in the irony that exists in a certain part. It's important to know where that is. And it's important to understand that that is a literary device used, or protege is a word that means, companion or student or someone who's going to learn from you. I'm not saying any of that's unimportant, but the broader scheme is the super important thing that we want to grasp on. So let's keep that in mind when we go to the third paragraph. Okay, so last paragraph, guys. Let's wrap up before we get to the questions. Couple key takeaways from the third paragraph. The party starts to wind down, right? The people are exiting the main hall. They're going into tea rooms. If anyone's ever been to, a kind of a bigger dinner party, kind of the way in which it's conducted is you have kind of the ball dancing type thing in the main room. And then as the night goes on, people start to trickle out. Either they get tired or they want to relax, they want to sit down, or they're done with the large social space. And they set up in these separate tea rooms, right, where you sit down for midnight tea or late night tea, or whatever it is. And the idea is you've made friends in the ball, and then you continue to get to know acquaintances in the various room you end up in after the larger gathering starts to shrink. And so we see that a lot, 48 through 51, right? That Catherine and Mrs. Allen can't really appreciate the looking out at this large gathering because it's starting to wind down, right? Everyone was shortly in motion for tea, and they must squeeze out like the rest. They're sort of forced out of the main hall into these separate tea rooms. 51 through 52, we kind of got in the second paragraph near the end that Catherine was super disappointed in how the night had gone. And that gets reiterated here, right? Catherine began to feel something of disappointment. She was tired of being continually pressed against by people, the generality of whose faces possessed nothing of interest, and with all of whom she was so wholly acquainted that she could not relieve the irksomeness of imprisonment by the exchange of a syllable with any of her fellow captives. She feels imprisoned in this awkward social situation where she doesn't know anybody, and she feels like she's powerless to really meet or control the situation. And that's a common thing that you can kind of understand, right? Like if you don't know anyone at a party, you can see how it'd be kind of awkward and embarrassing to remain isolated in that party and not be able to leave, right? Like if anyone's ever been to a party with their parents to their friend's house or whatever it is, and you're one of the only kids that's brought in, you don't really like your parents' friends' children, and you're by yourself, and you're forced into this social situation where you have to talk to people that you don't like or that you don't know. You can see how there's this awkwardness. But I want you to keep an eye out for the way the authors use words like imprisonment, captive, irksomeness. Whenever an author uses these kind of words that stray from the usual use of them, that's something that you should keep stock of. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record by the time this test review is over. But that's part of the active reading process. So just like I would keep track of things like shifts in character relationships, I'm also going to take note in my head mentally, okay, that word was odd as the author used it. And so could the test maker ask me about that? And if they did, well, what would the answer be? Why is that used? Or what does it mean in this context? Because I get the sense that captive normally means like a prisoner. Imprisonment normally means being in a jail. But indeed, that's not literally what Catherine's dealing with, nor is Mrs. Allen a prisoner or a captive in the common understanding as we know it, or what the average, say, English speaker would think if they heard that in isolation by eavesdropping on a conversation. By the end, they can't find Mr. Allen, right? They're looking for him, and then they're pretty much just forced to sit at this table with this other really large party. Everyone at the table seems like they know each other. It's just Mrs. Allen and Catherine are the odd ones out. They don't know where Mr. Allen is, even though they've looked for him, and they don't know where to go, and we're in this awkward disappointment. So we've reached the end of the analysis of the text. Here's what you always have to do. It's very, very tempting to immediately go from the word other at the end to question one. But take 5 to 10 seconds. You have 5 to 10 seconds. You'd be surprised how much time you actually have to just contemplate what happened. What did I just read? What occurred, right? Who were the characters? And if I take stock of my annotations, right, the final annotation in the margins, I think, would be, if I can get this for you guys, final disappointment. And that final disappointment being they're alone at this long table. Take stock of this. Use your mini annotations. Notice I created annotations in the margins. And so notice how I've been able to weave a structural summary of this passage. Most teachers will tell you sometimes, create a one-sentence summary, or what's a one-sentence summary of this long story. And they don't really tell you the operative tools that you need to use to build that. Right? Like, I've read a lot of these texts, these textbooks about how to approach the reading portion of this test, and they all will use phrases like that, like build a one-sentence summary or whatever that is, and they don't give you the tools by which to do it. I'm trying to give you the tools by which to do it, right? And you build it by building it in the margins, paragraph by paragraph. And so in the first paragraph, I have Mrs. Allen and Catherine get introduced. Mrs. Allen is this unremarkable but wealthy woman who's married to Mr. Allen, and Catherine is a younger woman who's presumably her maid. They come to this ball in paragraph 2. Catherine doesn't find any suitors because Miss Allen makes them late, and then all of a sudden it ends in a lot of disappointment because Catherine doesn't need anybody, but yet she's forced into social situations with strangers. Notice how in that brief time, in 10 seconds, I encapsulated everything that happened in that story. I got every main detail, every main bit that I needed to get the gist, to get the broad picture, to get the initial impression you should get before you get to the questions. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at each question. I'm going to give you some tools generally for how to approach the questions in a broad way, and then we'll work on getting through each one to get to the correct answer. So let's talk about these questions. Question 1's a classic lead-off question that the test likes to use a lot. Which choice best describes what happens in the passage? So we need to satisfy this general point here. Happens in the passage, not happens at one specific point or happens at two specific, but happens over the course. What's the best first impression? And the best way I find that you can get to this question's answer easily is by doing something called pre-phrasing. Pre-phrasing is I look at the question stem, and before I even look at the answer choices I'm given, I just think to myself, well, what would the right answer to that question be? And you'd be surprised if you can come to the answer yourself, then the correct answer becomes way more evident. The danger of not doing it, and this is what a lot of students get into trouble doing, is you want to just read the questions by themselves and you want to just use the formulations that the test maker wants to give you. And that's problematic on a lot of tricky passages. You want to understand the answers abstractly on your own, right? If you don't, then you pretty much just go by whatever the test maker wants you to think. And there's a lot you can do in the English language to invert meanings or create 99.9% right questions, 0.1% wrong, which invalidates the whole thing. And you'd be surprised again, if I can formulate it in my head first, when I see the correct answer, it becomes more self-evident. I get to see more of what's wrong with the wrong answers. More often than not, there's a lot wrong in the wrong answers. Very rarely do you get wrong answers that are super, super close. When you think about it, at least retroactively, there's a lot wrong with them. And then you can answer it more confidently. You got to trust yourself. Like, there's a huge part of this test, great performance on this test, that has to do with your ability to trust yourself and to trust that you're smart enough that you got the impression that you should have gotten if you were following all the right steps. So how would I pre-phrase the answer to number one? Well, I'd probably say that it's got something to do with the fact that Catherine gets disappointed because she doesn't meet anybody. That's the main thing, right? Like, yeah, a second main thing is about Mrs. Allen, but the broader takeaway I think that you need to get from this passage is that Catherine ends up in a position where she doesn't meet anybody, even though that's what the whole point of them going to this ball was. And so I look at these questions. Let's see. A young lady's evening is marred by her older companion's appalling lack of etiquette. Well, I mean, this is one of those true but doesn't answer the question answers. She's got a lack of etiquette, Mrs. Allen. Appalling, that's a very strong word to use. And that's not, I mean, in marred again, like, there's just too strong a language in this first one. It's marred. It's not like she was scarred beyond belief. And it's not like Mrs. Allen murdered anybody or, danced around in her underwear on the ballroom floor. Like, she was late because she cared too much about her appearance, and she didn't really seem to be too concerned about Catherine meeting anybody. None of that, I think, rises to the level of appalling or marring an evening, right? So for all intents and purposes, I get rid of A. A young woman enjoys a formal social event in spite of her inattentive companion. Well, we know this part here. Catherine doesn't enjoy it, right? We get plenty of text evidence from the passage that she does not enjoy the evening. And again, that's reiterated earlier in especially the end of the second paragraph, beginning of the third paragraph. A character is frustrated by her lack of opportunities to socialize at her first ball. That sounded a lot like what I said in my head. So I'm not going to just circle it and move on. I'm going to keep it, right? Think about the first time you look at these answer choices as just the first round of winners and losers. You get rid of the ones that sound just offensively wrong. You get rid of the ones that sound too strong. And you leave anything that might be true or might be the correct answer alone. And then your second time through it, if you need to, you can discern what's wrong with the close answers. And then D, a character is overshadowed by a chaperone in appearance, wit, and charisma. I mean, there's nothing in the text that supports the idea that Mrs. Allen is filled with wit and charisma that overshadows Catherine. In fact, there's plenty in the text that supports the opposite assumption about Mrs. Allen. She's unremarkable, and Catherine might even be more beautiful. Again, there's all of these unsupported assumptions. And so that's why, for one, I want C. So question two is one of these words in context questions or phrases in context where the test maker wants to see how well you can master what authors mean when they use certain words. Now, students get into a lot of trouble with these questions specifically because I guess you'd call it the traditional method by which these kind of concepts are taught is students understand language based off of what they want the words to mean. Right, so if anyone who sat in an AP literature class, whether as a student or a teacher, I mean, in Teach for America, I taught AP literature. I'm at the high school level, and you see a bunch of kids, they want to read into the text what they want to see. They want to see words that mean what they want them to mean, right? And that's fine, again, in a college level or high school level literature class. But here, the question is, can you read this thing and understand what the author understands themselves to be writing, right? Irrespective of what a word might mean now, or what a word means commonly, or what a word means technically, right? The common tricks that they're going to use to just keep in your mind before you even look at the answer choices. They're going to do what's called, they're going to give you the common understanding answer. This is what I kind of hinted at earlier, right? This is where they're going to give you a word you kind of know or you've seen before. And as an answer choice, they're going to give you something that the common person today would understand that phrase to be, right? A classic example, just before I get to 2, is if you're reading, say, Dickens, and you see this word, confidential, right? Most people look at that word in popular press today, and that word means being secretive, right? If Congress determined that documents were committee confidential, or the president exercised executive privilege to keep certain documents confidential, everyone would read that as saying, okay, it's secretive, not that many people can read it. But some people use this word confidential to mean something like a confidant, or if I feel as though I can confide in a friend. And that means to share or to express emotions or information to people that you trust. And so that's why a test maker might give you secretive as an answer choice, but the correct answer might be something like sharing, right? And so let's see if we can deduce the correct answer in 2. So I'm going to go up to 10 real quick. Let me get out of this to go use my mouse. Okay, so I'm going to start at 9. That's where the sentence begins. Dress was her the previous sentence begins. Dress was her passion. She had a most harmless delight in being fine, and our heroine's entry into life could not take place till after 3 or 4 days had been spent in learning what was mostly worn. So I know that being fine, again, we're pre-phrasing. I know that being fine, as the author uses it, is something that's very specifically related to fashion and dress. And so I know that, okay, the right answer's got to be loosely based or tightly based to that interpretation. So let's look. Appearing well-dressed. Well, again, like, that just seems spot on with what I said to myself, or what we said to ourselves collectively before we even looked. Evincing intelligence, no. Again, this is kind of opposite as to what the general impression of the first paragraph tells you about Mrs. Allen. Feeling confident. Confidence is a little bit different than feeling like you look good. Oddly enough, we tend to always conflate those two things. We tend to say, well, if someone looks good, they must be confident. But again, I don't really think we can jump inside Mrs. Allen's head and understand confidence, right? Like, that implies that you can jump in the mind of a character and talk about their emotional state. And I don't think just based off of the little snippet we got, we can do that. Displaying wealth is the one that's close, because that's a reasonable assumption, and that's a reasonable interpretation, because a student says to themselves, well, this person's obviously rich, and they obviously take a lot of pride in how they look. That must mean, by default, that the clothes they wear are of the finest quality, and the point in wearing nice clothes is to show off their wealth, like to conspicuously show how rich they are. The same reason why if someone drives a Maserati down the road, or someone buys the $500,000 Maybach or Ferrari, they're trying to display the wealth, right? More than they care about being in a car, they're trying to display wealth to third-party onlookers. But again, that's close and that's reasonable, but there is a huge difference between reasonability and safety. Reasonability is dangerous, right? Like, it was once said that human beings aren't rational animals, they're rationalizing animals. And if you give somebody a piece of information, they'll rationalize they'll rationalize whatever piece of inference they want, right? But we want to stay as close and narrow to the text as possible. It's in the context of dress, and so that's why appearing well-dressed is the answer I want. So I get rid of D, keep A. Question 3 presents a primary purpose of the first paragraph question. Now, we have to read these question stems critically. A lot of students see the primary purpose question and they want to answer it with the primary purpose of the passage or the primary purpose of a larger portion of text. And that's not accidental that answer choices are formulated in that way. Most of the time when they want to ask you a paragraph specific question, you will get some distractor about a passage specific question or a character specific question, something that answers the primary purpose portion, but doesn't get at the primary purpose of the first paragraph. And so let's think back. Let's use our roadmap that we created, right? The introductions to both of the characters and the fact that they were getting ready to go to a party. So what's the primary purpose? Well, I get that they were sort of constructing laying the foundations for the scene so that we can get to the party and understand that they're getting ready and they're spending all of this time, which is a way of manufacturing tension. And so I know that if I get something like that in an answer choice, I'm going to be able to know that that's kind of the correct answer that I'm looking for. And so let's look at these answer choices. To build tension and anticipation around an upcoming event. I mean, yeah. And I know what you're saying, right? Like, obviously, Michael, you pre-phrased it that way because you know the answers ahead of time. You've taken this ahead of time. And obviously, you're going to know what the right answer is, so your mind jumps there. Not really, right? You can do this with however the answer choices are framed. And it's not a matter of me knowing beforehand. It's a matter of me seeing the exam, how the test maker sees it, and seeing what information's pertinent to answering a question. I know that they're building tension to a social event, the social event being namely the ball. And I know the whole point of it is they're getting ready. And notice the tension that got created when it came to Mrs. Allen's fashion obsession. That fashion obsession created problems later. And so we built into this first paragraph tension. So let's keep going. B, provide context useful in understanding the narrator's emotional state. That's close, but the narrators, I think, is problematic. I mean, narrator's emotional state also, I don't know if an emotional state is crafted in the first paragraph, let alone the narrator. If I remember correctly, and I'll go back, I'll refer back to the text. It's a third person narration. I mean, we get Catherine and Mrs. Allen discussed in the third person. And so whoever is at the reins of this story, it's definitely not with the intention of elaborating upon their emotional state. And so for that reason, I think, if I can get back to my magic marker. For that reason, I want to get rid of B. Sharply contrast the social status of two main characters. Well, I don't know, you kind of indirectly get that Catherine might not be in the same social status as Mrs. Allen. But that's not the main purpose of the first paragraph. Think about how huge of a statement that is. The main and primary purpose of the first paragraph is not to demonstrate to you that Mrs. Allen is richer than Catherine, or that Catherine's richer than Mrs. Allen, or that both of them have the same social status, or whatever it is. That's a minor indirect detail that you have to infer out. And so because of that, I get rid of C. Establish the narrator's perspective on a controversial social issue. I just don't see where you get any of that from the text. Again, the whole purpose of this first paragraph is an introduction to the characters, a couple insights into personality traits of those characters or details about them, and building towards going to a ball later in the passage. And so I get rid of D. I want A, right? Build tension to the anticipation around an upcoming event. Questions 4 and 5, pretty straightforward, I think, in this passage, based off the information we have and based off of the reading method that we use to to get to the heart of what was going on in the passage. So let me break this down for you. I mean, it's not as easy as you'd think. As presented in the passage, Miss Allen is best characterized as, well, where was she introduced? She was introduced in the first paragraph. So that's where I think my analysis needs to start, right? Again, I'm trying to pre-phrase. She wasn't remarkable. She wasn't beautiful. She wasn't a genius. She didn't have a good manner. She's obsessed with fashion. She didn't really care too much about Catherine when they were at this ball. So all those things got to factor into the correct answer. The correct answer's got to include all of that stuff. And remember, if even a part of an answer is wrong, the whole thing must be invalid, right? Plenty of students sometimes tell me that, I looked at this question and I knew it wasn't 100% right, but it was the best one I thought. And so I knew a part was wrong, but I picked it anyway. Never go about it that way, right? Like something is either 100% the case or it is not, right? So let's look at these questions with our pre-phrase in mind. Outwardly friendly, but inwardly selfish and scheming. This you need to infer. I don't know where you get scheming. Inwardly selfish. I mean, she's super obsessed with how she looks. I mean, maybe you can get to selfishness. Outwardly friendly. I don't really know if we can get outwardly friendly from this either. She says that she's sorry that Catherine hasn't met anybody, but she says it so much that even Catherine starts to not really consider it. And so I don't really like how A is formulated in that vein, so I get rid of A. An ideal companion for a young woman because of her youthful qualities and popular. She's definitely not an ideal companion for anyone, it seems. She's so obsessed with her own appearance, she makes them late. So I get rid of B on that basis. Relying solely on her husband to make social introductions. Well, it's kind of an implicit presumption, the entire passage. They're not with Mr. Allen. And even at the end, they have to go looking for him. So I don't like C because there's no way I know that they're being introduced by Mr. Allen to other people. And so D is the only one I have left. Just going to check it to make sure it comports with what I said. Generally unremarkable, yeah. And ineffectual in helping her young companion meet people. Well, yeah, right? The first paragraph answers this portion. Right, this is revealed lines 1 through 15. Ineffectual in helping her young companion meet people. That's basically the end of the second paragraph on. And so I pick D. Now, when it comes to 5, it's also kind of a detailed question. It's just based off of how you were able to interpret what Catherine was thinking and how she was interpreting or orienting herself based off her own expectations. So the question asks, the passage indicates that prior to the ball, Catherine's expectations. Well, if we go back, right, always refer to the passage. It's sitting there. You might as well go back and look at it. She says at the end of paragraph 1, when she's introduced before the ball, right, I look back at my annotations and it says Catherine and Mrs. Allen get introduced before the ball. That's where I'm going. End of paragraph 1. With such encouragement, on line 20, Catherine hoped at least to pass uncensored through the crowd. As for admiration, it was always very welcome when it came, but she did not depend on it. She's being very cautious, and she has moderate assumptions. She's not expecting too much. She doesn't expect the world. She's just expecting a few things. Nothing crazy, nothing spectacular. And she's trying to temper her expectations. Not getting your hopes up is how we would probably say it, right? Like I remember when I applied to colleges and I applied to Yale and in Harvard, and my teachers were always telling me the same thing. Don't get your hopes up, which doesn't mean don't try. It just means temper your expectations. And so let's look at these answer choices. Cautious and moderate, sounds like it. Optimistic and unreserved, well, optimistic maybe, but unreserved, definitely not, right? So I get rid of B. Constantly shifting, I don't know where you'd get that from, right? Constantly shifting in what, right? How? What do you mean by this word shifting? What's constantly mean? Wildly indifferent, well, she's definitely not indifferent. Right? Indifference would mean She wouldn't care if people talked to her either way. And so she wouldn't be as welcome to it as she says she is, or as the narrator tells us she is. And then wildly, I mean, I just don't get the wilderness or the wild character that word implies. And so I get rid of D. I go A. Question six. Question six is a classic command of evidence question. So we need students to be able to understand notions of support, what it means to support the previous question, right? Like when we say that, we mean that there's one of these answers that's going to say it as plainly as possible and plainly articulate the answer to the previous question as plainly as possible, right? Students see this word. Students see the word best in the answers in the question stem. And they immediately think that every single one of these checks the box of support, and they have to like rank order them like, oh, this one does it the best, and this one kind of does it, and this one does it the third best, and this one does it the fourth best. That's not the proper way of conceiving of this kind of question. One of these does the trick. One of them, three of them do not. Now, there's various levels. There's various levels by which the other support doesn't get to the heart of what the previous question asked you, or what your answer to it was. One of them says it and says it plain. And notice the added advantage of reading it the way that we talked about with these building the road, with these roadmaps, building through a passage to get the big picture. When it's asked about, well, where'd you find that evidence of Catherine? Well, I asked myself, where'd you go to find the support in 5 before you even knew that there was a command of evidence question? I went to the end of paragraph 1, right? I went to the end of paragraph 1 when it told me about what she thought of the upcoming evening. And so I go back 19 through 23. That sounds pretty good. Sounds like C, but I'm just going to check 10 through 14 to see if I get anything out of it. I know 10 through 14 through my previous analysis. That doesn't talk about really Catherine. Catherine isn't even introduced until the end of that. So it can't really be 10 through 14. If I look at 14 through 16, that just tells me that Catherine does a bit of shopping and that she got some stuff. That doesn't tell me anything about her expectations. And then when I get to option D, 30 through 33, that's too far in. Catherine kept close at her side and linked her arm too firmly without a friend torn asunder by any common effort at struggling commit. That doesn't tell me anything about Catherine's expectations. Her expectations are revealed before she gets to the ball, not after she's already gotten there and experienced it. And so that's why right off the bat, I can see clearly based off of how I went about answering and how I went about annotating that I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that, but I like C. 7, as in line 33, assembly most nearly means. Well, again, assembly, I'm taking that it means like a large group of people probably. When I was in high school, that meant a rally, right? So be careful of the baggage because as I just demonstrate, that's baggage. I have my own prior expectation about what a word means. So let's go into this text, right? Always refer back to the passage. Catherine kept close at her side and linked her arm too firmly within her friends to be torn asunder by any common effort of a struggling assembly. Okay. So let's see. Production stands out to me as no right away. Rally is that common understanding answer. Right? Event. Well, the assembly is at the event. The assembly is not the event, right? You wouldn't say the assembly at a football game is the stadium or the game, right? Like the fact that the Patriots play the Rams in the Super Bowl is not an assembly. The assembly are all of the fans that come, right? The crowd that comes to see. So I don't really like A. So I'm stuck behind crowd and rally. Well, rally implies a purpose. or a level of specificity about what the crowd's there for. I can't get to any of that, right? I don't know that it's not a rally, it's a ball, right? So the purpose, the level of specificity and what the event is, I don't like B for that reason. It's crowd, right? That's the assembly that I like the best. The passage most clearly implies that Catherine's feelings towards Mrs. Allen. Remember, what did we talk about when we were at the end of the second paragraph? I mentioned there's a shift in Catherine's attitudes. And that's going to come up because that's a subtle shift. And a lot of students make the mistake of not really closely reading the text. And so they miss that subtext, right? They miss the underlying relationships, the underlying feelings that characters have towards one another, and when they change. But again, I'm pre-phrasing 8 before I've even looked at the answer choices. I know that there's a shift between Catherine being grateful to Mrs. Allen for including her in this party at this event or chaperoning her, and her frustration to how ineffectual Mrs. Allen is to finding her a person to dance with or a young gentleman to be acquainted with. And so I know that going into the answer choices. So let's see. Reflect Catherine's appreciation and relief. Well, appreciation, sure, but she's definitely not relieved at anything. A shift from gratitude to frustration, that definitely makes sense. I'm going to keep B. I'm not going to pick it, but I'm not going to get rid of it. Are colored by sisterly affection. I don't know how you get to C, right? I mean, sisterly affection, they don't really seem sisterly. I mean, even if they were sisters, I don't really see where the affection between them comes. Are based on Catherine's nervousness. Well, it's not really a matter of nerves, it's a matter of frustration. So B, right? She's grateful that she's being taken there. She's grateful at the view, the ability to experience it. But over time, remember, at the end of that second paragraph, the fact that Mrs. Allen tells her so many times that she's sorry she couldn't find a dancing partner, it frustrates her. And lo and behold, for 9, if I can jump to 9 asks me, well, how do I support B? Well, I know, where did that shift happen? That shift happened in the end of the second paragraph. And more specifically, it happened around 43. For some time, her friend felt obliged to her for these wishes. But they really repeated so often, and proved so totally ineffectual that Catherine grew tired and at last would thank her no more. 43 through 47. I know that, and boom, B is my option. See, again, I have a structural understanding of this passage before I get to the questions. I know where the key concepts are in the text. I built a roadmap while I was reading with my low resolution summaries in the margins and just briefly annotating. I know where to go. And so I can glance through A, C, and D to confirm, and you can do that between 5 to 10 seconds. But notice I've eliminated the need to spend a minute to 2 minutes on 9, right? Because I know where that shift happens to a very high level of specificity, I can eliminate a few answers right off the bat. And it just makes your interpretive exercise easier, right? You want to make the job easier for you to get through because we have a time constraint here, right? You have 13 minutes per passage to get through the reading and the questions. And so you're trying to get ahead of the 8 ball as best you can. Let's go to the last question on this first passage before we move on to the next. The references to imprisonment and captives in the third paragraph mainly have which effect? What did I say beforehand, guys, right? Take stock of when words are used in ways that are outside the norm, outside the traditional way, outside the common popular parlance that you've heard, right? I get that to pre-phrase, she means that she doesn't have power in a situation. Prisoners do not have power. right? Captives don't really have power. If you're chained up on Alcatraz Island, you don't have any power to affect your life or your day, right? And so I know it's got something to do with the fact that she feels powerless in her study, right? She's crammed in this tea room with no one that she knows, but yet she's forced into these awkward social interactions. And so let's look at these answers. 10, they reflect Catherine's distrust. She might be distrusting of Mrs. Allen, but certainly the words imprisonment and captives aren't the ones that tell you that she is distrustful, right? That's the way in which we need to critically assess the question, right? And before we move on to the rest of the answers, I just want to repeat that the students that do the best on this reading portion are the ones that are critically reading the text, the question stem, and the answer choices, right? Because all of that is fair game for the test maker to mess with you. So you need to understand that your job as a critical, active reader begins when the test starts and ends when you're on your way home. There's no real break to being a critical assessor of what's going on. So let's look at B. They evoke Catherine's sense of powerlessness. Yeah, that's kind of what it's meant to do. C, they reveal Mrs. Allen's longing. Those words aren't really used to describe Mrs. Allen at all. They're Catherine's reflections. They capture the assembly's shared fear of confinement. This question asks you to jump into the minds of characters that aren't even named and then wildly speculate about their emotional state. There's no way in which we can jump to that conclusion. And so I get rid of D. The answer is B, right? So what I want you to take away from this first passage is essentially a reading method that can direct you in the way to understand the gist, to get an understanding of the structure and the pattern of how the passage plays itself out. And when we approach literature, the key focus should be one of character development, character traits, and the relationship of characters to each other, right? And just more and more active reading strategies that we'll keep talking more and more about over the course of the program. All right, so let's go to passage 2 here. Sorry for the background change. I had to move a little bit, but it shouldn't be too big of a problem. This passage, I'm hoping that you guys picked up on. It's pretty much just a question gets posed by the author about this certain phenomena. And then through a study, the scientist seeks to understand why that phenomena occurs. And so let's take note, again, paragraph by paragraph. Let's see how the author wants to introduce us to an idea. But I'll just turn my annotation functions on. So the first paragraph opens with what's a normal social situation that most people, adults and children, have been in, right? I've chaperoned middle school dances before. I've participated in middle school dances before. And that's precisely why the author uses this one. It's an easily approachable example. So let's look into it a little bit. So he talks about chaperoning a dance and asking himself a key question: why aren't they dancing? And so then he goes into a little bit more. It's crazy how these kids, just a few years ago, right, were dancing all the time. They were dancing in the back seat. They were dancing, everywhere you could see in front of adults, their peers, strangers. What's going on here? And then we see the classic phrase, "we suggest." And so this is where you should know that, okay, he poses a question as to why a certain phenomena occurs. And now here, from this point on, here's his attempt to understand and or explain. So I noticed this phenomena out in the world, and as a part of a research team, I'm going to try to explain it. They go starting on line 9. We suggest that one crucial reason is the development of the child's awareness that their peers may be critically evaluating their abilities. And then he goes on further. We explored the link between children's ability to understand the minds of observers and their willingness to perform by giving them a choice to sing, dance. So this first paragraph, basically all that's going on here is acknowledging how a phenomena works, or the existence of one that's kind of odd to see, right? If you look at a middle school dance, you see the boys on one side, girls on the other, and very rarely do they want to dance in front of each other. And then there's a brief description about why the author or what the author thinks is the reason for that. And then in the final few lines, right, lines 14 down through, I believe it's 17, we have a little bit of discussion of the parameters of a study they're going to conduct, which is very typical of social science and scientific passages. They want to explain the parameters or the way in which they're going to conduct a study to try to explain the phenomena that they've detailed. Right, so how would we go about defining or generalizing about this passage or this paragraph? Because we want the gist. Well, I would just go something like phenomena plus explanation, right? Because all I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture the gist. So the phenomena part captures this first portion of the paragraph, and then the explanation is encapsulated in the parameters that the author discusses. All right, let's go to the second paragraph. Here's where we have an introduction. Now, you should always take stock, especially in the science passages and the social science passages, of when authors introduce concepts. Because most of the time, they're going to be very alien to most students. Most students do not study in depth psychological concepts that psychologists and social scientists seek to explain. But we don't really need to worry about it because the author will always go out of their way to explain it for us. So the theory of mind is generally viewed as a positive development, typically beginning around age 4, with sharp increases. The overwhelming consensus, it allows children to achieve success in the social world by interpreting human behavior and understanding cultural means and social norms. So this whole paragraph, and it goes on to explain what variables of human behavior theory of mind sort of influences. I know that right off the bat, this whole paragraph is going to be best generalized as just the theory of mind, right? Like that's the author introducing that concept to you. In the theory of mind, again, it's just the way in which your brain develops the capacity to perceive social setting, right? The ability of your brain to perceive and navigate through the social circumstances that you find yourself in. That's where, he goes on to end this paragraph. Why would increases in theory of mind and understanding the minds of others be linked to a decrease in the desire to perform? Right. So again, paragraph 1 and 2, identify a phenomena, outline the parameters of a study, and discuss one of the main theories that is going to be involved in the general research question that we have. Let's go to paragraph 3. We good with this citation? I'm just going to erase some of it. We hypothesize, so again, we hypothesize that improved theory of mind would predict other children's decreased willingness. This is his hypothesis. This is what his study seeks to, gauge out. So right off the bat, I know there's some form of this paragraph that's dealing with the hypothesis. And then, they just set up the methodology, right? Again, we're just setting up the research program that we're going to test out our theory. Next paragraph. Children were interviewed one by one. Again, we're just talking, more about parameters here. So, I'm just going to cite parameters of the study. They're given these tasks, right? And notice if I cite parameters and I use that as my paragraph annotation, then I kind of know what that means. Well, it means all of the specific parts of their study. And so if I get asked a question about the exact specs of that study, I know I'm going to start at line 41. And that's going to direct me to being able to answer questions about command of evidence or support or where in the text, right? Because notice from the last passage we read, we want to be actively engaging in the structural composition of this passage. And then again, more so here are the measures. Of theory of mind. I'll just use TOM as a abbreviation for it. 3 measures that they're linking to it. Now we get to the data on line 61, right? Line 61 through 69. Here's some results. All right, so notice it's all been building up to the research results. I've got an intro by anecdote. I've got the presumptions that the author has for the topic. I've got the parameters of the study. I got how they pick their kids. I get the questions they ask the kids, and now I'm going to get the results. And if I'm an active reader, I'm also going to start to predict what I'm going to see next after I get the results. And typically, I'm going to see something about either the need for further research, or I'm going to see a commentary just explaining out the results and why they're useful, right? The so what paragraph. So it's either one of those two, so far as I know. But I'm just starting to engage in the predictive part of being an active reader. And then if you look at the data that the author shares with you, 31.2% of 3-year-olds and 18.8% of 4-year-olds chose to both sing and dance, and not a single child age 11 or 12 did so. That seems to support the author's contention about theory of mind, right? The older you get, the more able you are to perceive how others think of you or what others think of you, and then that tempers your actions. And again, that has something to do with how you navigate the social setting, right? You know, the reason why if someone messes up my coffee at Starbucks, I don't haul off and whip the coffee back in their face is because I understand based off of the social circumstance I'm in that's not appropriate behavior. And it's arguably a good thing that I don't do that, right? So it's just giving you data. The first thing you want to do when you see results or statistical results from a study is just play around with the numbers in your mind. Does this support the author's contention? Does it not? Does it have a qualified part of it that supports it, and then some other parts don't? So again, these are all the questions we want to ask ourselves when we're actively reading. Our study had several limitations. Right. This is triggering a lot of things in my mind right now. I get our study has several limitations. That is another way of saying the shortcomings. Most scientists, or at least some scientists in these passages, will acknowledge the limitations of their research. Either it's limited in their sample size, right? We couldn't get a big enough sample, and that way we have to be skeptical about what our data suggests, or we really couldn't get a prolonged point of statistical comparison. We couldn't stay long enough to really see how changes affect over time, right? If we got together and we wanted to poll the country on a political question, and we only interviewed people from Berkeley and Stanford's campus, the limitation of our study is that our sample size was too small, right? If we wanted to look at the effects of climate change on a certain ecosystem, it probably would be a limitation if we could only study a site for 5 years, as opposed to 30, 40, 50 years, right? I'm just starting to name off some limitations. But notice what we did the previous paragraph. We thought about where the author would go, and this fits within our understanding of where the author would go. So let's see what he says. But our results suggest that theory of mind may also be linked to decreases in enjoyable behaviors. This unwillingness to perform likely perpetuates beyond school dances, affecting the willingness of people older than 12 to engage in playful behaviors as well. The appeal to more research. We need to do more research to know more. And then some other far-reaching implications that the author suggests that their study bears, right? The fact that theory of mind just doesn't temper itself off after the middle school kids go home and go to bed after their dance, that it affects adults, and that it also affects adults' willingness to engage in fun or positive behavior, something that's enjoyable to them. They'll try to not do because of how it might look to others. And again, that's a principle psychologically that I think a lot of us have an intuitive grasp over, right? Like there are plenty of things that I like to do that, I don't know, my fiance might think are weird, and so I don't really do them. And that's kind of what this author's getting at here. All right, so let's move to this graph. Every SAT's got a graph component. And most of the time, as someone who studied economics in college, the graphs are never as complicated as you think they are, right? The graphs are just put there and structured in such a way because they hope it disorients you. Right. But you'd be surprised how able a smart kid can look at this and just gauge, okay, well, what are the variables being measured? What are the metrics, right? What are the variables being measured and how are they being measured? And so we have our little key. A lot of graphs on the SAT, it's called the key, or it's also sometimes called a legend. This is just to explain what you're looking at. A lot of kids get really under the gun of the time. They're always checking their watch or checking the clock, and they want to rush right away into just looking at the graph for a tenth of a second and then move on to the questions. And I'll start to look at the graph when I'm asked about it. That's the wrong way to go about this. Your best bet, while all the ideas are still fresh, before the test maker's gotten the chance to mess with you, your best chance is to take all the info you got in your head, apply it to the graph, and just look at it, right? Do the variables support the author's contentions, or do they not? And you'd be surprised if you give yourself 15 to 20 seconds right after you're done reading, and I look at the title, the legend, and then I vaguely look at the variables and the metrics and on the axes to see how things are being measured and what's being measured, right? And these are the results from the study, right? So then you ask yourself those questions. Well, what does this say? Well, it says, here's theory of mind. So this is the ability to perceive how others think of you. As this goes up generally, we see all these activities bear on whether or not, in relation to the theory of mind, how do all these other activities fare? And so as it goes up, what's this line here? It's singing. Singing goes down, right? The author kind of hinted at that. What's this line here? This other dotted line is dancing. It follows the same downward slope. And then they both sort of temper and plateau. And then what are the other ones? Well, to circle and to color, right? Those were the two non-performance-based tasks that the author gave the kids to perform. And notice as theory of mind goes up, what happens? These two variables go up, right? So the author postulated that as theory of mind goes up, a willingness to perform performance-based tasks will go down and non-performance-based tasks will go up. And it seems like that happened. Okay. Let's once more go to these questions. All right, and remember, just like last time, we want to pre-phrase every answer because we want to build our capacity to confidence. We got to be able to strut through this test with confidence that we can understand abstractly the ideas, and we don't need to rely on the test maker giving us answer choices for us to know what's going on. We need to arrive at that understanding by ourselves. So let's look at this. The author's description of the middle school dance in the first paragraph primarily serves to. All right, so we talked about this in the first paragraph, right? It's a common thing that scientists do. They understand that they're going to explain something to people that might not otherwise know what they're talking about. And so to sort of grab the reader and help them understand, I give this familiar example that everyone knows, right? Everybody's experienced a dance before in school. And it doesn't matter. Yes, your parents went to dances. Your parents maybe danced on the dance floor at the dances they went to, right? I'm sorry if that comes to a shock to anybody that's watching this, but I know that that's what it was used for. And I can be confident in that, right? And so before I even looked at the answer choices, I'm not second guessing myself in any way. So let's look. Offer a familiar example of a social phenomena. Well, they did that, right? That's almost verbatim what my pre-phrase was. Illustrate the needlessness of certain social events. I mean, no, that's way off base, right? We can't get there. Prove that adults lack understanding of children. I mean, that's kind of the cliche answer. That's the answer that's, again, just like cliched in pop culture that adults don't understand children. And that's not really why the author's using middle school dance, right? We're looking for the rhetorical use or the rhetorical purpose of why the author would use this example. Provide the readers with useful background knowledge. There's really no background knowledge given here. He sets up a familiar anecdote almost, but there's no background. It doesn't tell me anything about theory of mind yet. It doesn't tell me anything about, at least definitionally, it doesn't tell me about any studies that would bear out what he's talking about. And so while D is close, I think I want A. Okay, as is used in line 20, sharp most nearly means. Let's go back to it, line 20. And again, a good way of approaching these, you read the sentence it's in, the whole thing. And then if normally there's always context around here, right? This portion here, there's always enough context to figure out what these words mean, right? It used to be the case in the older test that you kind of just, you knew it or you didn't. But now, in the newer models, there's much more contextual evidence here to support whatever conclusion you have about what a word means. So let's look at it. Theory of mind is generally viewed as a positive development, typically beginning around age 4, with sharp increases between ages 5 and 6. Okay. So sharp is being used to describe the increase in a measurement. So let's look at these answer choices, what we're given. Intense. Well, it's not great, but I mean, it's okay, right? It's not offensively wrong, because when I think of intense, I think of if it was an intense increase, I think, well, gradual and then intense increase, right? And that's what the author seemed to suggest with a sharp. It's like a sharp turn goes up, right? So even if you're driving down this road, and there's the hairpin turn, it's a sharp turn. Whereas the same thing over here, it's a sharp increase, intense increase. But again, not great. Maybe there's something better. I'm not going to pick it and move on. I'm going to see what else I got. Violent. Well, violent's not really a word we use to describe statistical evidence or the way in which data works itself out. So I don't like violent. Moderate's one of those opposite answers, right? It can be tempting because it understands. I mean, it uses it in the way that is okay if you were describing stats, but it's the opposite of what's going on. And then explicit's close, but explicit is just it being clear or not. And you can have a gradual slope that is explicit. There's no inherent meaning in the word explicit that something is sharp or intense. So that's why I get rid of D. I want A. So 13 asks us a question: which of the following best describes the author's view about the relationship between theory of mind and self-esteem? Well, the author suggested in, I think, the first, or where was it? I'm going to start over. So 13 asks us a question about the author's views of the relationship between theory of mind and self-esteem. And what would they say about it? And we have to pre-phrase this answer too, and I think we can get there pretty easily. So for 13, I say to myself, well, he kind of implied that as your theory of mind and your ability to perceive how others think of you, as that goes up, the other stuff is going to come down, right? So if I just brief graph, as theory of mind goes like this, the author at least suggested that your self-esteem would go something like that, right? There's a chance that your self-esteem could be damaged, right? And where did he say that? Well, the first paragraph doesn't mention theory of mind, right? That's what the whole point of my annotations were, right? So if I go up, I remember that, well, theory of mind isn't even introduced until the second paragraph, right? And then even then, there's no comment about how theory of mind is implicated in determining something about self-esteem. It's pretty much just describing what theory of mind is. And it's not until lines 32 where we have the hypothesis that the author has about theory of mind. So what does he say? He says, we hypothesize that improved theory of mind would predict other children's decreased willingness to perform due to a heightened sensitivity to criticism, a resulting blow to self-esteem. And so there you go. Like, that lets me know that the author's hypothesis is that as theory of mind goes up, self-esteem comes down. And so let's see if there's a clear answer choice that lets us know that. 13 says, or 13A says, more evidence must be gathered and a new study conducted to determine this relationship. Well, it's not asking you what the author's determination was. It's asking about a view. right? So me thinking or hypothesizing that something is the case is not the same as me saying it is, right? So while the author said there's more evidence that needs to be gathered because of their limitations, he wouldn't suggest that we need to determine the relationship. He's hypothesizing about the relationship. This is a great example of recycled language. The author or the test maker wants to put recycled language into an answer choice to get you to be tempted into selecting it. Right? The author says plain and simple, more evidence is needed because there's a limitation in the research. But that doesn't bear on what the author's view of something is. He still holds his view, even though there's more research that needs to be gathered. Right? When Galileo dropped a few items from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, he was pretty sure that he was right, but more evidence needed to be gathered. So I don't like A for that reason. B, a well-developed theory of mind may leave our self-esteem more vulnerable to damage. It sounded pretty good based off our pre-phrasing and based off of the reference we made back to the text. People who understand social behaviors and cultural norms have high levels of self-esteem. That seems, again, it seems to be an opposite relationship type answer. The author thinks it's the opposite. They hypothesize it the opposite. D, an underdeveloped theory of mind necessarily produces, well, see, again, like, here's the thing that you have to realize in some of these social science and science passages. The thing that's complicated here is there's something declared necessary versus like incidental, right? We don't know what the causal relationship is between theory of mind and, you know, your self-esteem. The author suggests a link. There's no implication that there's a necessary causal connection between the two, which is why I don't like D. I like B instead, right? B is the initial formulation that we had when we pre-phrased. And then if I look just briefly at these, I know, okay, well, that was just in the paragraph that described what theory of mind was. Same with this, same with this. I'm left with D. D is the closest thing, right? This D is the precise lines we went back to. It's the precise lines that our roadmap told us to go back to, right? Social situation and study introduction, theory of mind, hypothesis about theory of mind. Okay, I'm asked a view about it. I go to the hypothesis paragraph, and that's where I get D. As is used in line 40, question 15, warrant most nearly means. All right, let's go up line 40. Although our sample size was small, the results were definite enough to warrant further study. Pretty much the impression I get from that sentence is he's saying, though we have this limitation, we still need more, and that justifies looking more, right? Because we have a little bit of evidence that looks promising, or a study looks promising. It's sort of like if you can imagine a pharmaceutical company testing drugs, and you know they use lab mice, and you know there's this one formulation of the drug that no mouse that's had it has had any bad side effects. The diseases that the mice might have has been cured, and that's a promising study. There's a limitation. We've only given it to mice. We haven't given it to people yet. But that's something that warrants further investigation because it's justified, right? So if I look here, it's definitely not precluding more study, because that would mean it would suggest that we shouldn't study it anymore, right? And that's not what the author's suggesting. When it comes to further study and further evidence, the author's very clear, very explicit, and very open about the fact that he thinks more is needed. Guarantee. There's no guarantee of more research, right? I don't think we can read it that much. Promise, same way that guarantee is wrong, right? I don't like these two for the same reason, but I really like justify. It justifies more research. So 16 is a very tricky kind of question for students, right? Reasoning by analogy or, hypothetical, right? So anybody in the audience that wants to be a lawyer one day, right, or wants to go to graduate school of some kind or study something like that, you need to get really good at reasoning by an analogy. So the author and the test maker want to ask you how well you abstractly grasp the argument. So I'm going to give you this hypothetical situation, and I need you to apply the author's reasoning to it. Much like in a court of law, right? When a judge asks a hypothetical question of a lawyer, and the lawyer needs to apply kind of the broader principle of their argument to the specific facts at issue in the judge's question. So let's look how this plays out. Suppose the authors wished to add an additional option for a performance task. Given the parameters of the experiment, which one of the following would be the best choice? Well, what was a performance task? Well, the authors were very clear about that. A performance task was one that involved some kind of acting, right? Some kind of, outward display in front of somebody else, as opposed to circling or coloring, which were the non-performance tasks. So I need something that's really close to giving a performance in front of people. Playing a part in a drama, that looks good. Guessing the emotions of a fictional character, that's not really performance, right? That's more of a non-performance analytical task, like answering a multiple choice question. Learning to read sheet music, again, there's no performance there, right? Because that learning to read sheet music does not mean that you're playing the instrument in front of anybody, right? Classic trick there. We tend to load this phrase, right, when we see it, right? And a lot of the students that I teach know how to read sheet music, and they perform in some sort of orchestra or symphony, right? We tend to think when I say learning to read sheet music, I imply that you're performing in front of people while you practice, you have a coach or something. But we can't get there here. And so that's why I don't like C. Executing a complex physical exercise. Well, that's close. But that's not really performance so much as it is just a physical activity. And physical activities do not carry the same kind of connotation that the author thought that performing or singing did. And so while that's physical, playing a part in a drama is the closest to the kind of performance task the author discusses. And that's why I want A for 16. 17 asks, according to the passage, a well-developed theory of mind is associated with the ability to. Well, I mean, let's go back to the passage, right? If a question is going to direct us to one specific detail of the passage, it's best to go back and check. And so I'm looking at this bottom part here, right? We hypothesize, that's the hypothesis. Let's go up to the explaining of theory of mind. The overwhelming on 22, I believe, the overwhelming consensus is that theory of mind allows children to achieve success in the social world by interpreting human behavior and understanding the cultural meaning of social norms. That's bingo, right? You see this and it's bingo time, because this is what's going to come really in handy to answer in this question. So let's go back. So I know it's got something to do with social situations. Perform fearlessly in front of an audience. No, actually, it seems like the author implies it's the opposite of that. Like it'd be stage fright. If stage fright was there, maybe. Successfully navigate social interactions. That seems like something very close to what we said in our pre-phrase. Evaluate changes in one's own self-esteem and self-confidence. There was no inference that it did that. Now, it does change one's self-esteem and self-confidence, but it doesn't give you the ability to evaluate it in yourself. In fact, most people don't even recognize that it's happening, right? That's what the author seems to suggest, that the adults that are looking don't know, and that there's the development in the child that they're unaware of. And so the fact that it says evaluate your change, that's why I don't like C. Interpret the surrounding physical environment. No, it's not physical, it's social. Right? The author was very clear about that. It's the social situation that theory of mind bears on, which is why I want B for 17. 18, very predictable here, right? Like if we're actively engaging in this test, like a test maker would, whenever the test is going to ask me a detailed question, I can assume that they're going to ask me some kind of follow-up If they don't, then they don't. But if they do, then I'm ready for it. And that's why I know that, well, where did we just go to answer 17? Well, the answer to 17 was found in lines 22, right? So right off the bat, I know just structurally where the ideas are present in this passage, which is why it's cutting down the amount of time I need to interpret anything else, right? That 14 through 17 is in the paragraph where they're just explaining the parameters. 22 to 28 I like because that's where I just read it from. There's another area of hypothesis there I don't like, 71 through 74, too far along. I want B, right? B for 18. So 19 asks, what is the rhetorical effect of lines 70 through 71? Let's go back up and just look. Always refer back, guys. They give you this text for a reason. 70 through 71. Our study has several limitations that warrant further research, but our results suggest that theory of mind may also be linked to decreased enjoyable behaviors. That's the limitations portion. And we knew that was coming, right? And so I know that I need to see an answer choice, or I need to see contained in an answer choice something to that effect. It nullifies the reader's confidence in the strength of the results. No, actually, it does the opposite. You know, we intuitively think someone's argument is stronger if they acknowledge the shortcomings of their own point of view, right? If you talk to somebody and they're well aware that their own view has its own limitations, that lends more credibility to their point. It convinces readers that the author's study is invalid, again, for the same reason A is wrong, B is wrong. It actually has the opposite effect. It builds the reader's respect for the author's positivity. I mean, I don't know that we can get positivity out of our study that has limitations. That's a little too far in the opposite direction. It shows the readers that the authors are aware of the study's shortcomings. Yeah. And we talked about this, right? That was the annotation we left in that last paragraph, shortcomings. That's why I want D. So 20 asks, according to the graph, which age group's data most clearly departs from the author's hypothesis? So first thing you got to ask yourself here, what's this, right? It's a graphic analysis question. So we're going to look at the graph in a second, but we need to understand what this is before we can even hope to answer this question correctly. Now, the author's hypothesis thought this: theory of mind goes this way, self-esteem goes that way, or performance tasks go that way, right? So if I find something in the graph where as the theory of mind goes up, something goes down, right? Or something like that, that's the answer. And that's the group I need to look at. So let's see. What age group? So let's see. Ages 3 through 7 seem good, right? As this goes up, these things go down, and then those things go up, the non-performance tasks. But once I get to around 8, it goes up, right? The performance tasks all go this way, and the non-performance tasks go this way, right? So this is the anomaly. That's the outlier. That's the part that does not support the author's hypothesis and that can undermine the author's conclusions. And so if I go down, I'm imagining that 8 is going to be one of the answer choices, and indeed, that's why I get to C. Right, C for 8. Okay, 21 asks, which of the following pieces of information, if included, would help the reader evaluate the strength of the data presented in the graph? So here's a principle of statistical research that is always paramount, and the author mentions this when he's talking about the shortcomings. It's the number. It's the number of students. Or, you know, we refer to it, anyone's ever taken an AP stats class or a stats class in general, we refer to it as the sample size. You really nerdy stats people like me, you refer to it to your N size, or the N size of your case study. The N is up, means it's a decent study, right? So if we had a sample size where N was equal to 300 million people in the United States, oh, no, wait, that is 1,000. I chose humanities for the right reasons, I guess. 300 million people. I'm trying to ascertain U.S. opinion. My N study is big enough, good, right? But the sample size is what we're looking at here. That's why I think I want to go to B, the total number of children from whom the data was collected. if I look at A, the period of time over which data was collected, that really doesn't impact what's going on in the study. It matters the age of the children, but the span of time at which the data is collected doesn't matter as long as I get kids within the parameters that I want. C, the year in which these results were originally published, that would not bear at all on what the graph is saying, right? You could then say that, well, if it's too old, it's outdated, but that doesn't bear on your understanding of what's going on in the graph. The number of scientists involved in the study, that again just doesn't do anything to understanding what's going on in the graph. All right, let's move on to passage 3. All right, guys, so passage 3 is a comparative passage, right? The Steven Pinker CRISPR comparative passage. Before I get to just an overview of what goes on, what are the main ideas that are presented in those two, and then getting to an analysis of the questions, I just wanted to paint a picture about what you need to keep in mind when you approach comparative reading whenever you see it on a test. Because it's not always going to be in the natural science portion. Right? We know that it can be a comparative GGC, it can be a comparative social science passage, and then through our program, even on some of the ACTs that have existed, the official ACTs, there have been comparative literature. Right? So I want to just briefly walk through how to approach these and why these are difficult. It sort of sets up always like this, right? You have passage 1, which is self-contained, passage 2 is self-contained, and they have generally pretty standard, straightforward arguments, right? We know that based off of the fact that it's not a full article, that the argument develops over a shorter period of time, and that we always want to keep these things straight. So as we're reading, we need to understand, okay, what are the main ideas in passage 1? What are the main ideas in passage 2? The second level of analysis you have to get to with comparative reading, however, is understanding this, right? You need to understand the relationship between the passages, right? They're more often than not going to be talking at cross purposes about the same kind of idea, or the principle is going to be the same, or maybe two authors are talking about the same historical figure, or maybe two academics are debating the merits of a certain interpretive method or whatever it is. They're going to relate to each other somehow, right? And we need to assess what that relationship is, right? Because some of the trickiest questions on comparative passages don't really have much to do with the specific the specific issues that are raised in each individual passage. Most students that I teach, they don't ever have a problem interpreting and analyzing these two passages as they are. But the difficulty comes with this analysis between the two, or the relationship of the two, right? Do these two people agree? Do they disagree? Is there some more nuance to their relationship, right? Well, passage 1 says, passage 1 and passage 2 agree that Abraham Lincoln was a good person, but they take different approaches to analyzing his character. Or passage 1 and passage 2 both have similar views about this new piece of technology, but they disagree over how it should be applied, or whatever it is. So sometimes you will have the agree-disagree dichotomy, but there are times in where you'll have a very nuanced view, or the authors will have a very nuanced view about the topic that they're discussing, and then that nuance will bleed into a more complicated relationship between them, right? So another classic thing I just want to cover right before we get to the question is a key question type that exists here. We've talked about question types before so far in our program, and it always helps be able to perceive and qualify what questions are, what they're asking for, and what your task is. But one classic one is a reiteration of synthesis, right? So it's a question that pretty much just asks about, the question that we mentioned earlier, right? This issue, the relationship. Now, a couple common tricks that you should be able to look out for. Sometimes the synthesis question inverts the relationship and asks you a question about the inversion of the relationship. Now, Michael, what's that mean? It means that suppose that passage 1 and passage 2 disagree with each other, right? Passage 1 says Abraham Lincoln was a bad president. Passage 2 says Abraham Lincoln's a good president, right? Your job, and what the test maker might want to trick you on, is they'll ask you a question that sounds like, which one of the following would the authors both agree on, right? Because it's coloring your interpretation to think, well, if they disagree on this thing, then they disagree on everything about that thing. But right, again, when we talk about nuance, we need to understand that no matter how deep or profound the disagreements are between the authors, or how seemingly deep and profound the agreement is between the authors, there's always wiggle room where they'll either always agree on something together or always disagree, right? And it could vary in terms of how complicated that inference is. Okay, so before we get to it, I just wanted to lay those things out. So, passage 1 is Pinker, talking about this CRISPR, which is like genome editing, right? And in the implications or the moral implications of this tech, right? And so I just want to, just map it out for you here. The moral implications of this tech, passage 2, is written by Edward Lanphier, and this is a different. I'm going to try to get his name correct, and just this is the dichotomy you have to see. All right, so let's get through an analysis of these two, and then we'll fit our analysis of this passage into our broader understanding of comparative reading. All right, guys, so I just wanted to pull out a few key ideas from Pinker, right? So Pinker over here on the left, and then Landonier or Lanphier over here. Pinker starts out, right, in this issue over here, there's some moral implication of biotech, right? So there's this new technology, CRISPR, editing genomes, where it's a very esoteric process of understanding genomes, genotype, phenotype. Really, you don't really need to know any of that, but all you need to understand is that there's this new technique for how to edit a genome that has some implications for how it's going to affect human health. Like what he says on line 5 through the end of the paragraph. Indeed, biotechnology has moral implications that are nothing short of stupendous, but they are not the ones that worry the worriers, right? So Pinker has this very optimistic view of this tech, right? He thinks that it could be stupendous in its effects on health or human flourishing, a phrase that we're going to see him use later, right? So in this second, we have this identification in the first paragraph where the author just talks about the moral implication of biotech. Second paragraph here, he pretty much starts off with the classic conversation of relating to a common experience that the reader might have, right? Have you ever had a relative who died prematurely, right? We all tend to, or so Pinker thinks, we all have this relative, that has either experienced cancer or some other debilitating disease that shortened their life prematurely. He pretty much takes this to suggest in a broader context that there's a lot of needless suffering that can be aided significantly by advances in biomedical research, right? So he then says, where is it? He says down in lines 15 through 20, in 2010, it was 2.5 billion, which means that about a third of potential human life and flourishing goes to waste. The toll from crime, wars, and genocides does not come close. Wars, genocide, and crime do less, Pinker seems to suggest, than our inaction on this issue, or not our inaction, but on these preventable diseases that maybe biomedical research can ameliorate or kind of stop from happening, right? Like maybe there's a way in which we can get to the bottom of this to not only save lives, but improve human well-being. And then the third, so here I would just comment something like there's wasted flourishing, right? That's pretty much my summary of paragraph 2. Paragraph 3, the biomedical research then promises vast increases in life, health, and flourishing. Again, this idea of flourishing. And we're going to talk about this a lot when we get to question 22, because that's one that tempts everybody into picking the distractor. But it's important to understand how the author's using this phrase flourishing, right? Flourishing is not just the absence of disease or the absence of some sort of painful condition. It's a positive thing that branches out. And so here I would just continue with this idea of biomedical flourishing. All right, let's look at this next paragraph. Next paragraph, I'm going to erase this, guys, if you don't mind. The next paragraph, my bells start to ring, right? Because he starts off by saying, some say, and everybody, or almost everybody who's read an informational text before, who's read an argumentative text before, whenever you hear an author say some say, or it's long been believed, or most people believe, or the common view is, this is the common view. And the author is setting up to challenge that view. So what is the common view? Some say that it's simple prudence to pause and consider the long-term implications of research before it rushes headlong into changing the human condition. So there are some people that think, hey, you know, it's great that we're doing this, but we need to pause. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much because we don't know what the side effects could be. We don't know what the unknown or unintended consequences of biomedical research could be. But then he goes on to say, but this is an illusion. Notice, as soon as I see some say, I mapped out the first part of this paragraph because I know that, okay, well, here's the common view to pause and be patient. And then the challenge comes from the fact that he thinks it's an illusion. And so he continues on. First, slow-moving research has a massive human cost. The longer we wait, the more people die, right? Or the more people suffer, right? If we have the ability to cure cancer, for example, and we decide not to do it right away and we decide to drag it out over a few years of research, that has a human cost to it. It's not neutral. Right? So that's one part of Pinker's critique of those some people that he mentions in the beginning of the fourth paragraph. Every 1 year delay in implementing an effective treatment could spell death or suffering for millions of people. So again, the massive human costs are being quantified, possibly millions of people. First, second. So he's ordering this so perfectly for us. He's laying out the structure just as we would want. Second, technological prediction beyond a horizon of a few years is so futile that any policy based on it is almost certain to do more harm than good. So not only is it taking long and costing additional human suffering, but it's doing way more harm than good. Biomedical research is fairly predictable, he says. Research is defiantly unpredictable, right? 19 years after Dolly the sheep was cloned, we are nowhere near seeing parents implanting genes for musical, athletic, or intellectual talent in their unborn children. And the other direction, treatments that were decried in their times as paving the road to hell, vaccines, transfusions, anesthesias, are all exceptional booms in human well-being. Right? So this is just a further challenge. To the some that are mentioned. Biomedical advances will always be incremental, right? So it's slow moving. So just a brief, before I get into passage 2, it's always good. You stop at the end of passage 1, you just compartmentalize what was said. Steven Pinker thinks, if I go through, that there's a biomedical tech that can impact human health. He says that there's a wellspring of human flourishing that can be activated by advances in biomedical research. He brings up criticisms of people that think it should go slower, or we should take more precaution, or we should be more wary of whatever unintended consequences may arise. And then he challenges that view. He says that, well, yeah, that's true, but scientific discovery moves really slowly, and it doesn't really progress with the rapidity that is dangerous. And so Pinker is on this, if I draw the little over here, when it comes to this, Pinker has a more positive view of this tech. Let's move to passage 2. All right, guys. So passage 2 is from a different group, and you should have picked up your first read that there's a disagreement, right? That indeed this sum that Pinker references are these guys, right? So let's walk through this paragraph by paragraph. It seems like in the first paragraph, the author is suggesting that this tech could be helpful, right? He doesn't disagree with Pinker on that. So we compartmentalize this, right? This is an area of agreement between these two. It could be helpful. They wouldn't disagree on its effects on human life. They both agree on that. They just come to different conclusions about how to handle that effect. All right, so let's see. In our view, genome editing in human embryos using current tech could have unpredictable consequences, right? Therefore, we are concerned that public outcry about such an ethical breach could hinder the promising area of therapeutic development. So here is, I'd say something to the effect of unintended consequences. And in public opinion. I don't know why I put a G there. So unintended consequences in public opinion. At this early stage, right, he's emphasizing just how early on we are in this endeavor, right? Like we don't know everything yet. He's emphasizing that so he can then support his conclusion that we should hit the pause button, right? So that's why he said that should a truly compelling case ever arise for therapeutic benefit of modification, we encourage an open discussion. He doesn't want to modify anything yet. So he's saying hit the pause button. Right? It's too early in the stage to know what's going to happen. Let's pump the brakes. Let's pause. Right? Which is much different already. I get the sense that I understand the relationship between the passages at this point. And I'm just waiting for passage 2 to play itself out. I understand at this point so far, right? I'm always going to be on the lookout for twists. But so far, I get the general sense that Pinker thinks this is good, and because of how slow the research moves, it should be allowed to go ahead at its own pace, whereas this guy is citing unintended consequences and how new the research is as a rationale for halting it or pausing it or otherwise slowing it down. Then passage 2 goes into a commentary going on to the next page too about how the international community views this, or how Western Europe specifically views this. So what I did here is I just cataloged it as this is just, international context, right? And you know that the international context is not going to stray from his main point, right? Authors do not include large-scale public law or public referendums to discredit themselves while they're writing. That's just not how authors rhetorically operate. So let's move on to the next page and see what happens. Yeah, there's even more consensus around his view. 15 of 22 nations prohibit the modifications of Gremlin, right? Although the United States has not officially prohibited it yet, they will not at present entertain proposals for the alteration, right? So again, more international context to support his idea that it's too early and we should pause. And then he says, here's the key, right? This word gives us the takeaway. Key to all discussion and future research is making a clear distinction between editing in somatic cells and in germ cells. A voluntary pause in the scientific community could be a very effective way to discourage Gremlin modification and raise awareness of the difference between these two techniques. So there's two techniques that are at issue here. Now, Pinker did not mention that, right? But here, the author's like, well, there are these two different types of editing, and we need to further distinguish them. And so, again, I want a voluntary pause. So notice here, if I just draw, again, passage 1, passage 2, there's a disagreement about the future or the future actions, right? That's the main relationship. They disagree about how to proceed. Now, what they agree on, and before I even get to the questions, it's good to note, okay, what did they agree on, and then what did they disagree on? What they agree on is the massive impact that this tech can have. Neither of them doubt that issue. And so I know right off the bat, I'm trying to play with a lead, right? It's like I tutor a lot of kids that play tennis. You would rather play up 40 love than deuces, advantage other side in the last game of the match, right? Like with your season on the line. You get tenser, right? You want to play with a lead. Football players, basketball players, just easier to play when you already have a sense of, okay, what's going to happen, right? So again, I'm just taking stock before I get to the questions. what was the main relationship, and then what are some ancillary considerations that I can keep in mind before I get to the questions. Okay, 22. Regarding the moral implications on lines 5 and 6, the author most likely understands those implications to be. Okay, so whenever it's directing us back to the text to look at something, we should always go back and check it out. Indeed, biomedical, right, reading right. Let me get this for you guys. Reading right here. Indeed, biotechnology has moral implications that are nothing short of stupendous, but they are not the ones that worry the worriers. Okay. So remember, we're going to pre-phrase this out. I'm going to write this in big, bold letters over here. Well, big, but maybe not easily read. I should have been a doctor. I know that when it comes to the moral implications that he's talking about, he's connecting it, and he goes on to connect it with the potential to improve human life and improve what he says human flourishing, right? There's this idea that the moral implications are its impact on flourishing. So let's look at this. Let's look at these questions. The ethical imperative to assist those who are less fortunate. Well, someone being less fortunate seems too broad of a term. That's number one. Also, ethical is the trick here, because most people think that these two words are interchangeable, right? They're not interchangeable. Ethics is a practice, and moral is a concept, right? Your ethics are how you work out your morals in the world. And then even it goes into imperative. I don't think he says that we have the imperative to go out and help people specifically. He just says that, well, this can have a massive impact on it, so we should proceed with the research, right? The imperative, if there's an imperative at all, is to continue the research. And again, I don't like the formulation of less fortunate. He seemed to describe it in terms of those who were sick and suffering, and less fortunate is overly broad in A. And again, ethical and moral, they're not the same, even though they have sometimes interchangeable meanings in popular conversations. The need for caution when assessing risks and rewards of new technology. He actually doesn't really say that much, right? He actually says that, well, sure, be cautious, but it's going to move too slow anyway, and the rewards are going to outweigh that. The reader's duty to keep an open mind when considering conflicting viewpoints. That's definitely true. I mean, you should do that, but that doesn't get at the heart of the question, right? So I want D. It's the potential to significantly increase human health, because human health is much like the human flourishing that he brings up, right? Pinker being the Harvard professor who has written books upon books, right, of human flourishing, right? The Better Angels of Our Nature, Enlightenment Now, just books about the idea of improving human health and human flourishing. Let's go to 23. 23 asks us, according to the author of passage 1, so this is Pinker, right? I write it. You might not need to, obviously, but I write it whenever it's asked of me in that way. According to Pinker, the potential harms of new medical technologies should be entirely disregarded. Already, this seems way too strong. Right? You should be cautious of those extremes. Since considering them will only delay the development of new treatments, again, too strong. Can be safely dealt with as they emerge because of the slow pace of medical research. That sounds like what he said, right? It's always incremental, right, in the second column. So I'll keep B. Will never outweigh the potential benefits that such technologies will bring. I don't know if he said never, right? Never, again, for the same reason that A is wrong, right? The word never, always, every, like these words just imply too much. Authors, most of the time on the test, are making more moderate claims as opposed to radical ones. Are illusory, fabricated by researchers who are anxious about rapid change. That's too far in the opposite direction for Pinker. And so I think for Pinker, I want B. They can be dealt with safely. And if I wanted to, I could go up and I could check I think he says, yeah, on this last paragraph, starting on line 43, biomedical advances will always be incremental and hard won, and foreseeable harms can be dealt with as they arise. As used in line 30, spell most nearly means. Let's see. Even a 1-year delay in implementing an effective treatment could spell death or suffering for millions of people. So let's see. Right off the bat, right, what do? They give me the common understanding spell. I think, I'll just draw the wizard hat for you. Not a bad hat, actually. Well, and at any rate, they mean spell in a different way, but the trick that most people think is this bewitched means spell, right? But no. Write out, that's not really the way in which we use write out in that way. Write out death. Now, result in death sounds better. To thwart death, this is the opposite answer. So I get rid of that. I get rid of B. I want C, result in death. 25, the discussion of Dolly sheep, line 35 to 38, primarily serves which purpose in the passage? So let's always go back, 35 to 38, Pinker. 19 years after Dolly the sheep was cloned, we are nowhere near seeing parents implanting genes for musical, athletic, or intellectual talent in their unborn children. So it seems like he's trying to use this as a way of downplaying our ability to accurately predict consequences, right? Like, yeah, no, we had this new technology in cloning, but it's not like it's resulted in the stuff that all of the naysayers thought it would result in. Right? Because again, it's in the part of his passage, if we remember our annotations, where he's starting to challenge the view of the people that want to be hesitant and want to be cautious. He's challenging them. And what's the way he's challenging them? Well, here's an example where we made an advancement and all of the naysayers were predicting that we would be using genes to harness musical, athletic, and intellectual talents. That never happened. Right? And so again, it's just a way in which he's trying to bolster his claim at the expense of his opposition. So let's look at 25. The discussion of Dolly's sheep again primarily serves which purpose in the passage? It illustrates the inability to accurately predict the consequences. That sounds like our prephrase. It demonstrates the ways in which science has ignored issues of morality. That doesn't really work out here. I don't think you can get there. It reveals a crucial misstep in the history of biotechnology. He's not saying it's a misstep. He's actually using it to prove out his hypothesis that we should continue making more steps and not to be hindered by our cautions. It suggests the vast potential of biomedical technology to transform human life. Well, he believes that, like that's definitely true, right? He believes that. But the question's asking a specific rhetorical point about a specific reference or allusion the author makes in the passage, and that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to illustrate the inability to predict. All right, 26. Regarding the ethicists mentioned in line 47, what can we infer about them? So let's look. Research will always be closer to Sisyphus than a runaway train. Now, I know just from context, Sisyphus must be some sort of slow-moving entity because it's being compared to a runaway train. The last thing we need is a lobby of so-called ethicists helping to push the rock down the hill. So what would he say about that? Well, his broader claim, again, is in the paragraph where it's incremental, right? Science does not move like the runaway train that the ethicists think it is. And so I get the sense that before you even look at the answer choices I'm given in 26, it's got something to do with the fact that they have a misunderstanding of how fast the research moves. It moves quite incrementally, but they think it moves like a runaway train. So let's look. Pinker views their judgments as deeply mistaken. Pinker sees them as wrongly applying ethical standards to scientific matters. I don't think he thinks that. They're insufficiently informed about the ethical principles that matter, that are under this device. I don't like that one either. They wish to return to a way of life which is less reliant on technology. I can't get there either. Their judgments are deeply mistaken. Notice, that sounds more general than what my prephrase was. But because I have the prephrase to start with, I can understand when a question is phrased or an answer choice that's given to me is more general, but still akin with my pre-phrase, versus if it gets more specific. Some tests, answer choices, sometimes they give you a generalized answer that operates at a very high level of generality. They have deeply mistaken judgments. And so, well, judgments about what? Well, the judgments are about how fast the tech moves and what we should do about it. Right, so I want A for 26. 27, the central claim of passage 2 is that genome editing technology have positive potential, but remember, pre-phrase, think about it. He disagreed with Pinker. He thought we should have more caution. And why? It's new research, and we don't really know the consequences yet. And we would rather hit the pause button and just figure out what we're doing before we go full steam ahead. So let's look at the answers I'm given. Might have unforeseen consequences. That sounds pretty dead on. B, are justifiably illegal in most countries. Justifiably, I don't know about. Illegal in most countries. He mentioned most Western European countries, but most countries in the world? Right, can't get there. May prove more beneficial than scientists predict. He wasn't saying that, I don't think. May cure fewer diseases than originally thought. Again, like, he doesn't disagree with the idea that it could be beneficial for humans. But his primary concern is we should hit the page button, the pause button, sorry, because this tech might have unforeseen consequences. So I want A for 27. Question 28, as used in line 81, entertain most nearly means. All right, let's see. 81. Although the United States has not officially prohibited gremlin modification, the National Institutes of Health explicitly stated that it will not at the present entertain proposals for gremlin alterations. It's definitely got something to do with whether or not they'll read through it or consider it. So divert, no. Regulate, well, there are no laws, right? So they're entertaining a law. No, entertaining a law is not what, like, regulating is creating law. Entertaining whether or not something should happen is not regulation. To repudiate, no, they're just trying to consider it. They won't consider it, is what they're saying. So 28, I want B. On which of the following points, 29, would both authors most likely agree? See, if we're reading like we've talked about, right, I see this question coming. Because I get to the end of passage 2 and I say to myself, well, these two disagree about the central premise of the passage, right? About how fast technology should move. They disagree about that. But I got to think about the things they agree about too. And what they definitely agree on is that there's huge potential impacts for human life, right? Like, that just comes through. So I'm already prepared. I'm on the lookout for what the correct answer is. I've read it. I've understood it, sorry. I know what the agreement is. So let's see. CRISPR has many current applications worth investigating. Maybe. Genome editing technologies have the potential to greatly affect human life. Sure. C, the benefits of CRISPR outweigh any potential drawbacks. Definitely not. Passage 2 does not agree with that. That's a Pinker point. The public's mistrust, well, the public's mistrust is mentioned, I think, only in 2. So C is a point made by the author of passage 1. D is a idea that comes from passage 2. So let's look at A and B. What makes these two different? CRISPR has many current applications with investigating. Well, they don't really agree, or they don't really talk in agreement a lot about this issue, right? Passage 2 talks a lot about this issue broadly outside of the context of CRISPR. CRISPR is more just like a conduit, right? Anyone who's ever been to a ventriloquist exhibit, right? They use puppets to project their voice. Like, CRISPR is kind of like the puppet here. It's just the tool that we're using to have this conversation. They're actually having a broader conversation about genome editing technology in human life, right? And they agree that there's going to be a lot of effects. So I want B for 29. 30, the author of passage 2 would most likely respond to the discussion of CRISPR in lines 24 through 30. This is, again, it's easily called a response question. And it's definitely phrased just like it is here. Passage 2, how would they respond to these lines? And you need to understand the argument enough to put yourself in the shoes of the author of passage 2 to respond to Pinker. So let's look at 26 through 30, see what Pinker actually says, or 24 through 30. Some say that it's simple prudence to pause and consider the long-term implications of research before it rushes headlong into changing the human condition. But this is an illusion. First, slowing down research has a massive human cost. Even a 1-year delay in implementing the effective treatment could spell death for suffering for millions of people. How would the author of Passage 2 respond to that? He'd probably say something to the effect of, well, whatever breakthrough you think you might get, the public's outcry will be enough to stop it, right? Like, so either way, like whatever breakthrough you think you're getting, the public is going to have something to say about it, because Passage 2 mentions public opinion, right? So I got to be wary about that. So let's look at the prephrasing. A major disease, just get my annotation tool out. A major disease cannot be cured so easily. Well, that's definitely true, but that doesn't get to the heart of what the author would say to Pinker's specific point about CRISPR. Potential breakthroughs can be hindered by the public outcry. It sounds like my prephrase. Biotech research must be pursued at all costs. Again, Passage 2 wouldn't say that. I don't even think Pinker would say it at all costs. I don't even think Pinker would say, well, like, if we looked to advance in biotech, 2 billion people would die, right? I don't think Pinker would say, yeah, let's throw it into high gear, right? So that is even too strong for Pinker. D, policies can only be decided after extensive public discussion. That, again, might be true, but it's not how the author would respond to that specific point made by Pinker in lines 24 through 30. So I want the public outcry. And where does he talk about that? Well, if I remember correctly, let me see. Just get rid of my drawings. Therefore, on line 59, we are concerned that a public outcry about such an ethical breach could hinder a promising area of therapeutic development, namely making genetic changes that cannot be inherited. Right, so right off the bat there, boom, I'll go back 30. Is that one of the lines? Yes, it is. It is option choice B. I could go back and check each of these three, but B is the correct answer. Okay, so Passage 4 is your GGC passage from Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. This is the passage where she's talking about women's intelligence or women's development and how it's been stunted. It starts off with this idea of, well, women couldn't write a Shakespearean play. And so let's take stock here. We tend to see, as we're finding our way down, GGCs, even though the language or the syntax is tough, right? The syntax and the diction for all you guys that take AP language. This is hard. And why is it hard? Well, because they're writing in a verbiage, and it's almost like a second language. It's like the first time, I took a class on legal philosophy in college, and you have to read some French and some Italian articles. And it's like handing me that at first. It's like the only way you get good at a language is you have to practice it, right? Same thing with an instrument or whatever it is, or a sport. But once we get past this difficulty, we find out that the authors really grab onto one main argument, and then they flush it out as much as they can with things like analogies or allusions or hypotheticals. So, let's look at this first paragraph and see what Woolf does. She finds it deplorable that nothing's known about women before the 18th century. So why is that, right? Obviously, they weren't educated. They weren't taught to write. They were put off to marry right out of the nursery at 15 or 16, right? So she keeps suggesting that there's little that women could do at that point, right? Like, you can't expect a person who hasn't been taught how to read, or hasn't been taught intellectual curiosity, or hasn't been taught any of those skills, you can't expect them to all of a sudden wall off and write Macbeth or write Richard III. It doesn't happen. So in a way, it makes sense to her that women haven't done it yet, because there's no opportunity, or so she says, right, before the 18th century at least. And then she goes on into this priest, right, or this guy, he talks about how there's this lady that wrote him, and here's this, I just want to put this out here. Great example of voice, lines 19 through the end of the first paragraph. Very sarcastic here. How much thinking those old gentlemen used to save one. How the borders of ignorance shank before their approach. Cats do not go to heaven. Women cannot write the plays of Shakespeare. So we go on. There seems to be a little bit of a concession of sorts, right? Which is kind of what we talked about earlier. Well, based off the fact that you haven't reared this group of people to do certain things, so Woolf says, yeah, you're right. Like they wouldn't be Shakespeare in the age of Shakespeare. Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister called Judith, let us say. So here's the, if I were to summarize this, I would just go Judith. Right, here's the Judith example. Her mother was an heiress to grammar school where he may have learned Latin and elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well known, a wild boy. And then she goes into this discussion of like, would the woman have been able to experience this stuff? Would Judith have been able to experience all these transformational parts of life that aid to the creative process? Right? Like, would she have been able to take a dinner in a pub or walk the streets at night or experience life in a way that would aid in her creativity? I mean, human creativity is aided by the ability to integrate and negotiate the world, right? Going places, seeing things. There's no coincidence that a lot of great writers in history were also really well-traveled people who experienced a lot of things, either personally or in their travels. Right, so she seems to suggest over the course of this passage, it's very difficult because of the diction and the syntax. But notice her argument, right? We don't even need to really break it down too much. Her argument's really straightforward. It's that like she's repulsed at the fact that women, there's nothing really known about them, and apparently they weren't educated. They're married off really young, or they're otherwise not taught. And then she gives this hypothetical to try to explain it out, right? Well, obviously, if you deprive somebody of creative development, they're not going to be creative enough to do what Shakespeare did. Shakespeare got to go to the best schools. He learned Latin and Greek. He got to experience life. He got to go out in the streets on his own, right? Like you experience stuff when you leave your home, and that impacts your ability to construct stories, to construct any manner of creative activity. Okay, so straightforward reading. Let's see if some of these questions are equally as straightforward. The main purpose, well, already, before I even look at the answer choices, the main purpose was to discuss gender inequality, right? Between, like, for example, Shakespeare and the hypothetical sister Judith, right? Just to cite the inequality between them. So that's why A stands out right away. Emphasize the value of tradition. She's probably arguing the opposite of that, it seems. Undermine the feasibility of a proposal. It's just too off base, right? Like what proposal, what feasibility. Highlight the importance of social background. That's one of the points she makes, but this is one of those answer choices where it's one of the purposes. Or it's one of the points. Right, arguably, but it's not the main one. A is the main one. 33, much the same way 32 is constructed. 30, the central claim. What are we on the lookout for? We're on the lookout for partial claims. Right, claims that the author made, but that don't rise to the level of the central premise. And so what is that central premise? Well, we talked about it, right? It's the idea that women couldn't become creative because they weren't given the opportunities, right? Judith doesn't write Macbeth or doesn't write Hamlet or doesn't write The Merchant of Venice. She doesn't write any of those things because she isn't given the opportunity that William was, right? To go to school or to experience a dinner in a pub or whatever it is. So let's see if there's any answer choices here that follow that. Women do not become renowned writers because in general they take fewer intellectual risks. I don't think the author would claim that. Outdated moral codes ruined a promising career of Judith. No, obvious reasons. Women could not develop their potential for literary greatness in the Elizabethan age due to a lack of opportunities. That seems to be the case. Women should receive the same level of formal schooling as men. That's definitely an implied claim. You can definitely infer that out. That's not the central one, right? The central one is indeed that the reason women didn't rise to the level of creativity in the Elizabethan period as men did was a denial of opportunities. 34, the statement in lines 9 through 11, they had is included primarily. So let's look at this one. 9 through 11. They had no money, evidently. They were married, whether they liked it or not, before they were out of the nursery. At 15 or 16, very likely. So again, it just seems to emphasize that lack of opportunity that the author's talking about in question 33. So let me just get back to where I was. So the rhetorical purpose here should be something along those lines. So let's see. Criticize an abusive marriage arrangement of the era. Again, that's definitely an indirect purpose, but it's not the main or the primary reason rhetorically the author included it. To prove that, in fact, a great deal is known about women in earlier times, no. Illustrate the constraints that prevented women from developing their talents. This sounds a lot like lack of opportunities. So I like C. Argue that poverty forced women into dependence upon men. No, maybe that's historically true. I don't know. Maybe it's the case that, some men ended up with all the cash and then women became dependent on them. Yeah, I don't know that. And the author doesn't suggest anything about that. And so it can't really be the primary motive for using a certain reference if that's not what the author said. So 34C. 35, as is used in line 39, the word escapade most nearly means, let's look at it, 39. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. So I'll go a little bit upwards. He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had rather sooner than he should have done to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. It sounds like it's something to do with an episode of some sort or an event. And it sounds like some of that stuff isn't great that happened. I mean, look at bore him a child rather quicker than was right. So there's something, as C suggests, something mischievous about it. It might be fascinating, but that's not what escapade means there. Cowardly retreat, no, definitely not harmless. And so I want C, a mischievous episode. Woolf's view of the bishop in line 14 is best described as, well, remember she mocked him. And that's where we talked about voice and her sarcasm coming out. That, oh, how great you are to spare me any thinking, sir. Right? So brotherly fondness, definitely not. She doesn't seem to like him all too much. Grudging admiration, there's definitely some grudging going on, but no admiration. Stunned surprise, not really. I mean, students might fall into this trap because of the exclamation point that was used to denote shock or whatever, but not really. I want mocking contempt, right? The contempt that was shown here. And then 37, I think we want that line of pure sarcasm that I just mentioned, right? Where is it? Yeah, how much thinking those old gentlemen used to save one, and it goes on to the end. It's just pure sarcasm. Right? She's being openly sarcastic to this guy. And so does that come up as an answer choice? Well, yeah, comes up in C. Question 38. In the final paragraph, Wolfe destined Judith Shakespeare to a grim ending in order to. It's before I even look at it, I pre-phrase it in my head and I say to myself, well, it's got something to do about the fact that these people had the same dreams and they're going to get to different outcomes because of that, right? So let's look if we get any answers here that look that way. Establish the fact that many unwed mothers ended up committing suicide. No. Demonstrate that women were not accepted as serious actresses in the theater. No. Blame William Shakespeare and Nick Green. No. Emphasize that men and women face many different outcomes despite having similar dreams. Right, so good, D there. As is used in line 60, craft. So let's look at craft. What's craft mean? She could get no training in her craft. It seems like craft's got something to do with a profession of some sort. Like Tom Brady, I'm a Patriots fan. Tom Brady hones his craft every day, right? So it's not really ability. because ability is what you use to do your craft. But if I'm great at throwing the football, it will make sense. My craft is being a quarterback. My ability is throwing the football, right? So B is gone. C, profession. Line 40, which of the following does Wolf imply as an important factor in a writer's development? Well, like, what do we say here? Well, I remember in the later on in the second, and then in the second paragraph, and then in the second column, it's about the lack of opportunities in human experiences, right? Not being able to take dinner in a pub, or not being able to travel the streets of London like her brother. So I look at it's about experiences, right? And so let's see, an unshakable self-confidence in the face of criticism, no. A willingness to take risks with the art, no. A careful balance between tradition and innovation, no. An important factor is just the opportunity to study a range of human experiences. 41, I want a support for this. And so I need to find where in the text did I get the range of experiences thing. And I'm pretty sure it comes from the lines that I was directed to earlier, honing her craft, right? Could she even seek her dinner in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight? Yet her genius was for fiction and lusted to feed abundantly upon the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. And so right off the bat, there you go, right? That's why for 41, I'm just going to quickly eliminate 41. I want C. Oh, I want, sorry, D. Okay, so passage 5, last passage in 005's reading section, is about hydraulic fracking. So the author begins with just a discussion about how, for a decade in Oklahoma, there was this huge boom in oil, right? Prices climbed over 100 a barrel. There was pioneering companies of hydraulic fracking, or fracking, a revolution that was headquartered in the state, right? So we have just fracking boom here. Right, that's the best low-resolution summary for this. The economic boom created an increase in the tax base, and then it created just a decrease in unemployment. Right, as oil firms started and expanded. When businesses expand, they hire more people. Right, so that's the first intro into the passage. The second paragraph, going down through line 17. It says, we should always be on the lookout for these keywords, right? We're trying to dissect and actively dissect these passages. So the but directly implies that whatever I just said before, I'm either going to qualify or I'm going to tell you the opposite implication. So if in the first paragraph there's an implication that what had just happened is positive, like tax bases growing, like unemployment falling, the author is getting ready to tell you that, well, actually, some other stuff that might not be so positive resulted. So here we have that oil prices fell, there was a decrease in demand, and then Oklahoma increased in a matter of earthquakes and the earthquake's magnitude. Man-made geological mess it created has gotten worse. So here, I'd just like to say, like, maybe we split it up here. There's a decrease in demand, D and D, decrease in demand for the oil, right? And then there's earthquakes. And this idea here, the second part, is where the author is going to elaborate for the rest of it. So let's look at paragraph 3. Historically, Oklahoma averaged about one earthquake a year, but frequently ratcheted as the oil boom took hold. Measuring an earthquake happened in Prague, Oklahoma, 5.6 on the Richter scale. So there's some increase in magnitude, right? So increase in magnitude. The Prague earthquake was the strongest ever recorded in Oklahoma, and its timing was no coincidence. So there's no coincidence between the increase in fracking and the incidence of an unusually powerful earthquake. And then, the rest of this paragraph is pretty much dedicated to the difference between, horizontal versus a vertical, right? Businesses used to use this, right? The vertical fracking, where you just put it directly straight down into a pocket to try to harvest natural gas or oil or whatever it is. Whereas horizontal was adopted because it's more efficient, it seems, right? Because if you can imagine over here, we have this well, right? And let's imagine there's this pocket of natural gas over here. If I vertically go, I might need to drill, a couple separate times before I hit the bingo and I get into the pot. But if I go this way horizontally, right, the horizontal fracking lets me cover more ground, right? It's more efficient. And then I access it more, right? That's why near the end, the success rate of the industry hovers around 80%. Whereas before, they didn't have that much success, right? 1 in 3 wells, which is about 33% for you math people. So we have this drastic increase between a 33% success rate and an 80% success rate as a consequence of shifting from the vertical method of harvesting the gas and fracking to the horizontal method. Just clear these, get back up to the top. Second column, scientists have known that humans can induce earthquakes since we've known that humans can cause quakes. Right? It's not new knowledge. It's not like we needed to wait to frack to figure out that we can affect virtually any kind of parameters in the ecosystem, right? Then it goes on to discuss some more scientific surveys, a geological survey, that there wasn't enough information to establish a link between oil and gas drilling and the state's increased seismicity. So that seems to suggest that, well, there's some evidence that there's no causal link. We're not sure of the causal link. But then pretty much down this area here is about politics, or what the text refers to as political back scratching. So basically what happens is with the political response, it's much less about how much we know scientifically versus, well, what's the influence politically of the energy industry or whatever it is, right? The gas industry, the oil industry. And that's where we get down to, I believe it's lines 53, to critics unwilling to acknowledge the connection was less about scientific ignorance than political back scratching. And then it goes on to discuss this governor, right? And how the energy sector is a generous donor, right? Which goes hand in hand with this political corruption idea previously. It's that the energy industry gives a lot of money to the governor's campaign, Governor Mary Fallin, and therefore you can understand the incentive for not wanting to say anything that might be detrimental or pejorative to the industry that's giving you a bunch of money, right? Like, it might not be a good idea if your parents are paying for your college to then go make official statements about how terrible people they are. That might not end up well for you. And so it's a similar kind of incentive working its way out here. Right? That's why it goes all the way down to, again, political back scratching. Let's move down here. Near the end, I'm going to start on line 70. It would take another 7 months until the state acknowledged that the scientific community and many of the public already knew, right? So eventually they're going to catch up. Until about a year ago, I think they were trying to pretend that we didn't exist, right? So again, more into the whole second column here is almost a commentary on just political corruption, right? How we knew about this thing for a while, but we were unresponsive because of money in politics or whatever. That's obviously the implication made here. Even as the oil boom recedes, its dangerous legacy will remain. Earthquakes create their own momentum, right? The more magnitude 3 quakes you have, the more 4s, the more 4s, the more 5s, on and on and on. So it's basically this snowball, right? So you can imagine just a little snowball at the top of this hill. And I grew up in New England, so we did this experiment a lot when we were kids. Snowball can be, if I'm 10 years old, I'm about this big. If I push this down the hill, all I need is that little push, and then this thing is going to establish a momentum of its own. And as it rolls down this hill, it's going to get larger, and it's going to get larger, and on and on and on. And then it's going to become a boulder, and that's the same thing that's going on here. Right? Even if I stop making snowballs up here, the legacy of what I've done has a momentum of its own. Once I pushed it down the hill, I can't stop it. Right? It's going to go until it ends on its own. right? That's essentially what's going on at the end of this paragraph. So before we move to the graph, just keep notice. Basically, it just told me that there was an economic oil boom in Oklahoma when it came to hydraulic fracking. There was a huge economic surplus when it came to less unemployment, and then just a bigger tax base. And then there was some tempering in the boom. We started seeing regression, and then people were getting laid off, and then we had all these extra earthquakes, and as a consequence of the earthquakes, there's this new momentum generated, and there's all this political corruption that's stopping us from actually addressing the problem in real time, right? So it's always good before you get to the question, just contextualize the information you read. Try to absorb the gist before you get corrupted by whatever formulations of the answer the test maker wants to give you. All right, so let's look at this graph. This graph, again, right, we talked about this in the second passage, I believe, about theory of mind. The title and the metrics used are enough to understand everything that's going on. Number of earthquake events over 2.5, and then yada, 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 until the boom, right? So if I could draw a line, if I wanted to present it like that, right, you can see just the outrageous exponential growth that seems to, just before I even think about it, seems like it supports exactly what the author is saying. And so for purposes of reading, of trying to get ahead of the test maker, trying to be active, analytical, perceptive, and predictive in my reading, I already know that, well, I get the sense that if I'm asked a question about whether or not this graph supports the author's contention, I know the answer is yes. And I know the reasoning for why that answer is yes, right? Because I know that, well, it's aids to the author's point because it demonstrates the exponential increase in earthquakes. So again, I sound like a broken record here, but I'm going pre-phrase all the way here. So for question 42, the main purpose of the passage, right? So the main purpose of the passage, it seemed, was to sort of emphasize or analyze particular motivations behind this new drilling technology, right? And then understand it, right? It was political. It was based off of the need to be more economically viable, right? So I know that that had something to do with it. So let's look at this. Explain the recent decline in the American oil industry? No. Analyze the motivations behind the impacts of a new drilling technology? Kind of, right? The impacts. So we have impacts being the increase of earthquakes, and then the motivations being profit motives, right? So there are the motivations behind it, and also I'd probably include something about the efficiency of it, and then boom, the earthquakes. B looks good. Describe the ways in which certain states have benefited from the boom. No. Objectively evaluate the belief that humans can cause earthquakes. No. One, objectively, I don't know if the authors seem to have a side in this debate, right? So whenever I see this word, I'm kind of suspicious as an original matter, because very rarely are authors objective. And then the rest of it, evaluate the belief that humans can cause earthquakes. Well, no, right? Like, actually, the author said that was given. Like, it was almost a given that we can do that. And the author mentioned at the top of that second column, right, that we've actually known that for a long time. It's nothing new, right? So that's why I get rid of D. I want B. As is used in line 11, outfits most nearly means. Let's go up to line 11. Similarly, outfits are losing money on every barrel. Well, that, I mean, seems like that's a commentary on companies, right, or some kind of business, which is why I look. Ensembles, no, it's not a cast in a Hollywood movie. Assemblies, no, it's not a school function or a legislature. Crews, well, crews might be the functionaries, right? You got to have a crew to harvest the oil, right? But really, it's businesses. C. 44, the author suggests that the drilling was replaced by a newer extraction method because of. Well, this is in the paragraph right at the bottom of column 1, and I'll go up to it in a moment, but I just want to understand it before I reference it, that the horizontal drilling became the predominant practice because it was more efficient and it was more accurate, right? We had an 80% acceptance rate or success rate versus the 1 in 3. And it was just a more efficient way of harvesting the product that we wanted to get. Right. So right off the bat, I know it has something to do with the efficiency, right? That has to go along with the horizontal fracking. And so if I go up, I know exactly what paragraph it's in, right? It's in this paragraph at the bottom of column 1. And I think, yeah, no, it says that, I think line 29, it was a costly endeavor, vertical fracking, with a success rate of only 1 in 3 wells. But new technologies, including horizontal drilling and fracking, allowed drillers to complete wells more quickly and efficiently, right? So it was the strategy that was more efficient. All right, so let's see if there's any answer choices here that comport with that understanding of efficiency. Vertical drilling's high cost and risk of failure. That sounds like exactly what our preface is. The invention of better tools for locating underground gas. It had nothing to do with the location of underground gas, right? Better tools for the location. No, it's better tools for the accessing of it once we've found it, right? So I don't like B for that reason. Political pressures exerted. No, political pressures have nothing to do with why horizontal drilling was adopted. The drop in price of crude oil. Well, that happened before there's even a discussion of types of drilling practices. So I don't like D either, which is why I'd pick A. And then 45, very standard. Again, we should be expecting this. Whenever we get a detail or a suggestion, inference type question, we should always be ready for them to ask where you get that inference from. Very standard, straightforward formulation of how these questions get written. And if we understand that, we can start to think about how we're going to answer the next question. Right? You want to start to think about that more and more and more as this program goes on. It's not just the question I'm answering now. It's where the test is going. And so, well, where would I look? I would look right at the area where I found it. I know it's not in this paragraph. That would just, it's the first and second paragraph where it's not even talking about the fracking procedures. Neither is B, right? Before I even look back, I know those lines aren't where I needed to go to find the original answer to 44. And now I'm only left with C and D. That's in D, if I remember correctly, I'll go up and check. D seem to just be telling me about how efficient today the industry's drilling success rate is close to 80%, right? That's all that says. Doesn't, the inference is that it's caused by the new horizontal drilling. But notice what you were asked in 44. You were asked in 44 about why vertical drilling was replaced. All right, if I can get this to work. You were asked why vertical drilling was replaced. It was replaced because it had a high cost and there was a huge risk of failure. And that answer is directly where, if I get my drawing function back, the lines 29 to 32, when it says that high risk of failure and it became inefficient. So 4501C. Question 47 asks about the word legacy as is used in line 79. So if I look at it, it says, even as the oil boom recedes, the dangerous legacy will remain. I imagine in that context, it's got something to do with consequence, right? Because like the snowball example we talked about, or like the earthquakes building its own momentum, the damage has kind of already been done. And so the consequences of that damage are still going to continue to recur, even though we're not drilling as much, right? So let's see if there's any of these answer choices that suggest that to me. Memory, well, again, common understanding or the common use. That's why they put it first, right? It's no coincidence that the common understanding tends to be one of the first options you're given, because most kids that are careless walking through these reading passages and questions, they're just going to look at this. They're going to look at memory. They're going to be like, oh, okay, that's, thank God these test makers are giving me a break, right? And they're giving me an easy, correct answer. So they just circle A, they don't check anything else, and they wander off to question 47. But But indeed, I don't want memory, origins. No, this is the opposite, right? I want what comes after. Perils, no. Consequences is the best answer. Question 47 asks the main purpose of the fifth paragraph, lines 42 through 46. So let's check that out. 42. Scientists have known that humans can induce earthquakes since the late 1960s, when researchers found that chemical waste injected background, the chemical waste injected underground at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal caused a series of quakes that were felt in nearby Denver. So let's see. Right off the bat, I know kind of that it's just trying to establish that there's some prior knowledge that human beings can make earthquakes, or that generally speaking, human beings can affect the environment around them, right? And so I know that's the purpose. And my prephrase is something to the extent of human beings being human effects on the environment being man-made, and the fact that we have an understanding of that originally, right? And for a long time, we've known that. So let's look at these choices. Show that scientists can't prevent wastewater injection. No, I mean, I don't really know where you get that from. Establish prior knowledge of man-made earthquakes. That sounds pretty good. Emphasize the importance of scientific knowledge. I mean, it might be important to have scientific knowledge, and the author would definitely agree with that, but that's not the rhetorical purpose of that paragraph. The paragraph isn't meant to suggest to you that science is important, right? It's meant to suggest something much more specific to you, which is to establish that there's prior knowledge of this human activity influencing earthquakes. Provide a full history. I mean, there's no full history here. Yeah. So I want B for 47. 48 and 49, right? Paired questions. The author implies that the Oklahoma Geological Survey. And so if we go up, where was that? Well, the Oklahoma Geological Survey was mentioned in the second column. Right, so I'm looking around here. Right, and this is, if you remember our annotations, I had to erase them because I moved the page, but if we remember our annotations, we remember that it was political back scratching and political maneuvering that resulted in how the survey was treated by, especially by the governor, right? So let's look and see if there's anything there that supports our preconception or our prephrase of 48. Was not adept at leading experts at identifying. Well, I mean, no, it actually seems to suggest they were actually pretty in tune with what was going on from the start. B is a cautious organization that requires overwhelming evidence. I mean, that might be true. I mean, I don't know if it requires overwhelming evidence, maybe just sufficient evidence, maybe just adequate evidence, maybe partial evidence. I don't know how that organization operates, and there's definitely no indication of that in the text. C classifies all earthquakes as naturally caused earthquakes. We know C is just not true, right? It doesn't comport with what the author's using that citation for, nor does it comport with our understanding of the organization from the text. D is subject to political influence and ignored scientific evidence to appease Oklahoma government. Yes, right? Again, political back scratching or politics generally. And where would I go to find this kind of stuff? Well, again, if we're understanding, it's almost like a textual geography in a sense. If we understand where we go to get the information in these command of evidence questions, they start going like this, because there's only so many options that you're given that are anywhere near the place in the text where you find that answer, right? And then we can limit it down by how precisely or how straightforwardly the support lends itself to our answer to the previous question. So let's look up. Where is the political back scratching or political influence? It comes out really clearly here, 53 to 56. By 2013, many leading experts were confident that the same phenomenon was playing out in Oklahoma. Nothing's really mentioned about politics until 53. So based off of that, I can get rid of, I think, A and B. Now it's just a matter of whether or not 53 through 56 talks about the Geological Survey's back scratching. The energy sector is a generous donor. See, again, here it's talking more about the governor than it is about the Geological Survey, which is why 49 is a question where I can get rid of, based off of their placement in the text, I can get rid of A and B. And then D is not focused on the Geological Survey as is. It's more focused on the energy sector's influence on the governor, which is why for 49 I want C. 50, the discussion of Governor Fallon right at that beginning of that big block paragraph that we were just at for 49. I know right off the bat it has something to do with the fact that she's influenced by her large donor. Like the energy industry is very generous to her, contributes a lot of money to her campaign or her election attempts, or her attempts to stay in office. So I know that's got something to do with the correct answer. So if we look, she does not have necessary scientific background to grasp long-term consequences. It might be true. I mean, maybe the author thinks that, but that's definitely not as strong as of an implication that money is influencing her decisions. In fact, you could actually get to the opposite assumption that she knows full well what the consequences are because we've known about it for a long time, but she's choosing to alter her perspective on it because of the donation she's getting. Her stance on earthquakes conforms to the interest of her largest donors. That sounds good. She is no longer trustworthy enough to serve. I mean, maybe she's not trustworthy enough. Maybe she's a really great governor on 99% of the other stuff. See, whenever there's a question that has that much of a I don't know factor, you shouldn't try to over reason yourself to it, right? That's where you get into the danger zone. Or you try to rationalize something to the extent that it gets kind of outside the box. So I don't like. She is the primary author of Oklahoma's economic. I mean, I don't know. I don't even know if the author believes that, let alone suggesting it in the text of the passage. So I want B for 50. The tone of the final paragraph, lines 79 through 85, is best described as, well, if I look to that final, the final paragraph, where it talks about how the legacy is not going to be overcome. The legacy is already set in motion. The consequences are already coming no matter what. It's got its own momentum. The more threes, the more fours, the more fives, the more fours, the more fives, so on and so forth. Some researchers worry about even bigger long-term consequences. I get the sense that she's at least partially worried, right? And so I look down to see if anything here matches that. Anxious definitely does. Unequivocal, not here. Incendiary, she's not really saying anything incendiary. And analytical, well, she was analytical at parts in this article, right? For a lot of it, she was. Maybe for as much as 75% of this, she's being analytical about a problem. But this last paragraph, there's more anxiety to do with the fact that, well, there's momentum here on its own, and we don't know how long or how bad the problems might be for as long as a period as they might go. 52, does the addition of the graph support the author's argument in the passage? We already answered this question before we even started looking at any questions. Right? We know from looking at the graph before we even got here, if we're doing our job right, yeah? If we know what that graph does and why the graph is there and what purpose it has before we get to the questions, 52 already gets answered. In 52, if I prephrase, I say to myself, well, yeah, that graph does, because it shows how fast it increased at the beginning of the oil boom. And so if I look down, A, yes, it conveys sharp increase around the beginning of the oil boom. Yes, because it illustrates the increasing strength of Oklahoma's earthquakes. B's not offensively wrong, so I suppose I wouldn't eliminate it right off the bat. I know C and D are wrong because the fact that it says no is wrong. It does support the author's claim. But then I go back to A and B, and I'm like, well, because it illustrates the increasing strength, that's not the primary reason that the author wasn't making the claim that just earthquakes in Oklahoma are getting worse. The author made the claim that because of the oil boom, earthquakes are getting worse, which is why I don't want B, I want A instead.